If you're enjoying this video, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Share it with your friends, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Every like and subscribe helps the channel grow. My name is Thomas Harland. I'm a park ranger, 42 years old, and I've seen my fair share of life's battles. I served in the Korean War, came back with a shoulder full of shrapnel, and then lost my wife to tuberculosis just last year. Life hasn't been kind, but here I am, trying to start over. They transferred me to this remote outpost in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Cold Creek, they call it. It's quiet, tucked deep in the woods where the trees stretch high into the sky and the air smells like damp earth and pine. I figured this place would give me the isolation I needed to process my grief. No distractions, no people, just me and the wilderness. The cabin they assigned me is small but sturdy. There's a wood stove in the corner, a cot by the window, and a desk where I keep my journal. That journal means everything to me. It holds pressed wildflowers my late wife collected over the years. Every time I open it, it feels like she's still with me somehow. The first day was peaceful enough. I spent most of it hiking through the forest, taking notes on wildlife activity for my reports. Spring was in full bloom, but something felt off. The weather's been strange lately, heavy rains causing floods in some areas, and the forest seemed quieter than it should be. As I walked along Cold Creek's banks, I noticed something odd on one of the ancient oak trees, a spiral pattern carved deep into its bark. It wasn't natural, too perfect for that, but it didn't look fresh either. Maybe some local kids messing around? I made a note of it and moved on. Later that evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a hunter named Warren Mitchell showed up at my cabin. He looked worried and said his teenage nephew had gone missing 2 days ago while out hunting near Cold Creek. He's a good kid, Warren said, his voice shaking slightly. Knows these woods better than anyone. I promised him I'd keep an eye out during my patrols. After he left, I couldn't shake the unease settling in my chest. The forest outside seemed darker than usual that night, almost like it was watching me back. As I lay in bed trying to sleep, I heard something faint, whispers, soft and distant, like voices carried on the wind. At first, I thought it was just the creek running nearby, or maybe animals rustling in the underbrush. But then, it started to sound like words. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, straining to hear more clearly. The whispers seemed to circle the cabin, growing louder and closer before suddenly stopping altogether. I didn't set sleep much that night. The next day, I tried to shake off the strange feeling from the night before. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I spent the morning organizing my gear and preparing for patrol, but deep down I couldn't ignore the whispers. That night, things got worse. I had just settled into bed when I heard it. A voice calling my name from the forest. It wasn't just any voice, it was her voice. My wife's voice. Thomas. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. It was impossible. She was gone, had been for almost a year now, but the sound was unmistakable. Soft, warm, familiar. Thomas, come here. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, scanning the trees around the cabin. The forest was still, except for the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze. But then I saw something, footprints leading away from the cabin into the woods. The problem, the door had been locked all night and I hadn't left the cabin until now. The footprints were fresh, too fresh to ignore. They looked human but slightly off, like whoever made them wasn't walking quite right. The steps were uneven, almost dragging in places. I followed them for a few yards before stopping myself. What was I doing? Chasing a voice that couldn't possibly be real. I turned back toward the cabin, uneasy, but determined not to lose my grip on reality. When I got back inside, I tried using the radio to contact headquarters, just to feel less alone. But as soon as I turned it on, all I heard was static, and whispers mixed into it. The voices on the radio weren't clear enough to understand, but they sent chills down my spine all the same. It wasn't normal interference. It sounded like someone or something was trying to talk through the static. Even my dog, Scout, started acting strange that night. He refused to go near a certain part of the forest behind the cabin, growling low and steady whenever we got close to it during patrols earlier that day. Before heading back inside for good, I found something near that area, a hunting rifle lying abandoned in the dirt. It was covered in a sticky sap-like substance that smelled faintly sweet but wrong somehow. I brought it back with me and locked it away in case someone came looking for it later. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there was watching me. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. My mind kept replaying the whispers, the footprints, and that abandoned rifle covered in sap. Something wasn't right in these woods, and I needed answers. I decided to start by mapping out the locations where I'd seen strange things, the spiral markings on the trees, the area Scout refused to go near, and now the spot where I found the rifle. Maybe there was a pattern. As I walked deeper into the forest, I ran into someone I hadn't expected to see. Martha Jenkins, an elderly woman who lived on the edge of the park. She was one of the few locals who hadn't been forced to leave when the park expanded years ago. Martha was known for her stories about the old days, but most folks dismissed her as superstitious. "You've seen them, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low and serious. "Seen what?" I replied, trying to keep my tone calm. "The hollow people," she said, looking past me into the trees. "They sucked her watching you now." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, but there was something in her eyes, fear, real fear, that made me stop. She told me about an old Cherokee legend, something her grandmother used to warn her about when she was a child. A spirit bound to the oldest trees in the forest. It could mimic voices, lure people into the woods, and they were never seen again. I thanked her for her time and moved on, but her words stuck with me. Could there really be something out here? Something ancient? Later that afternoon, a search party came through looking for Warren Mitchell's missing nephew. They didn't find much, just some torn clothing near a tree with those same spiral markings carved into it. The search leader chalked it up to a wild animal attack, but I wasn't so sure. Back at my cabin that evening, I tried calling my supervisor to report everything. The whispers, the footprints, even Martha Sepp's warning. But he brushed it off like it was nothing. "Probably just moonshiners or kids messing around," he said. "Don Sepp, let your imagination run wild." But this didn't feel like kids or moonshiners. It felt older than that. As night fell again, I sat by the window with Scout at my feet. The forest outside looked calm enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting out there, watching. That night, I had the strangest dream. I was walking through the forest, but it wasn't the same forest I knew. The trees were taller, their branches twisting together like they were alive. The air felt heavy, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots. In the dream, I came across a clearing I'd never seen before. There was a massive tree in the center, its bark covered in those same spiral patterns. As I stepped closer, I heard my wife's voice again. "Thomas, come here." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding like a drum. For a moment, I thought it was just a nightmare. But when I looked outside, my blood ran cold. The cabin was surrounded by a perfect circle of twisted branches. They were laid out neatly, almost like someone or something had arranged them while I slept. Scout was gone. His leash was still hanging by the door where I'd left it, but he wasn't in the cabin. Panic set in as I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, calling his name into the darkness. "Scout, come here, boy." The forest didn't answer me. It just stood there, silent and still, like it was holding its breath. As I searched around the cabin, headlights suddenly cut through the trees. A truck pulled up, and out stepped Dale Coleman, one of the park's maintenance workers. He'd come to drop off supplies but stopped short when he saw the circle of branches around my cabin. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, his face pale. I didn't have an answer for him. Instead, I told him about everything, Scout disappearing, the whispers, the footprints, and to my surprise, he didn't laugh or dismiss it like my supervisor had. "You stir not the first ranger to deal with this," Dale said quietly. "My grandfather worked these woods back in 1939. He disappeared one night while on patrol, left behind nothing but his boots and his journal." He looked at me then, his eyes dark with something that felt like fear. They called it the Hollow Walker. Sip, you need to be careful out here. Before I could ask him more, we heard it, a faint rustling in the trees behind us. It wasn't the wind, it was deliberate, like footsteps moving through the underbrush. Get inside, Dale whispered. We locked ourselves in the cabin and waited as the sound grew louder and then stopped completely. Scout never came back that night. The next morning, Dale and I decided we couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. Scout was still missing, and the forest felt wrong. It wasn't just the silence or the strange markings. It was like the trees themselves were watching us, waiting for something. We packed up some gear, flashlights, torches, and a couple of hunting knives, and headed out to search for Scout and anything else that might explain what was going on. Dale told me about a spot he'd heard stories about from his grandfather, a grove deep in the forest where strange things always seemed to happen. As we walked, the air grew colder, even though it was spring. The sunlight barely made it through the thick canopy, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been, the crunch of leaves under our boots, the snap of twigs in the distance. After about an hour, we came across an abandoned camp. The fire pit was still warm, but there was no sign of anyone around. Tents were half collapsed, and supplies were scattered everywhere, like whoever had been here left in a hurry. What happened here? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Dale didn't answer right away. He was staring at one of the trees near the camp, a massive oak with fresh spiral markings carved into its bark. This is it, he said finally. This is where it starts. As we moved closer to investigate, something caught my eye, a cave entrance hidden behind a curtain of vines near a small waterfall. The water looked clear and cold, but there was something unsettling about the cave itself. The walls inside were covered in carvings, warnings written in Cherokee symbols. Dale pointed to one symbol that looked like a spiral, surrounded by jagged lines. That's supposed to keep it away, he said quietly. Just as he finished speaking, we heard it, a voice coming from deeper in the forest. Thomas. It was her voice again. My wife's voice, but this time it sounded broken, like someone trying to speak through static. I froze, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I turned toward the sound. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another tree in the distance, but then it moved, fast, jumping from one tree to another like it was teleporting. Its limbs stretched out like branches, its skin rough and bark-like, blending perfectly with its surroundings. Don't look at it, Dale shouted, grabbing my arm. But I couldn't help myself. I stared as it moved closer and closer until I could see its face, or what passed for a face. Hollow eyes stared back at me, empty but somehow full of malice. Dale suddenly stumbled forward, his body stiffening as if he'd lost control of himself. He started walking toward the thing without saying a word. Dale, stop, I yelled, grabbing him and pulling him back just before he got too close. The thing vanished into the trees as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind nothing but silence. We didn't stop running until we were back at the cabin. When we got there, everything inside had been rearranged. Furniture moved around, supplies scattered across the floor. It felt like someone or something had been watching us even while we were gone. I didn't know what scared me more, the thing we saw in the forest or the fact that it seemed to be getting closer. That night, Dale and I sat in the cabin trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Neither of us said much at first. The silence felt safer somehow, like speaking out loud might invite whatever was out there to come closer. Finally, Dale pulled out an old leather journal from his backpack. This belonged to my grandfather, he said, placing it on the table between us. The journal was worn and faded, but the pages inside were filled with notes, dates, sketches, and descriptions of strange disappearances in the park going back decades. Dale's grandfather had been a ranger here during the late 1930s, and according to his notes, people had been vanishing every 17 years like clockwork. 1939, 1922, 1905. The pattern was undeniable. One entry caught my attention. The Hollow Walker grows stronger with each victim. It mimics voices to lure them into the forest, feeding on their memories until nothing is left. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read those words. This wasn't just a legend or a superstition. It was real, and it was happening again. Dale pointed to a sketch in the journal. A spiral surrounded by jagged lines, just like the carving we stood seen in the cave earlier that day. This is supposed to bind it, he said. But only if you know the ritual. I didn't know what scared me more. The idea that this thing could be stopped, or the thought of what might happen if we failed. As we continued flipping through the journal, the radio crackled to life behind us. At first, it was just static, but then voices started coming through. Help me. It wasn't just one voice, it was dozens of them, overlapping and broken like they were trapped in some kind of nightmare. Some sounded old, others young, but all of them carried the same desperation. Where are you? One voice asked. Don't sit, leave me, another whispered. Dale turned off the radio quickly, his hands shaking as he stepped back from the desk. Those are the people who disappeared, he said quietly. I didn't want to believe him, but deep down I knew he was right. Later that night, I heard her voice again. My wife's voice, but this time it wasn't calling me into the forest. It was describing something instead. Something terrifying. It's Seps coming for you, she said softly. I turned toward Dale, who was staring out the window with a blank expression on his face. My grandfather saw it too. He murmured, without looking at me. And it took him. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air as we both realized there was no turning back now. We had to stop this thing before it took anyone else. By the next morning, Dale and I knew we couldn't wait any longer. Whatever this thing was, it was getting closer, stronger, and more dangerous. We had to find it and stop it before anyone else disappeared, or worse. We armed ourselves with torches, matches, and anything we could think of that might help. Fire seemed to be its weakness, according to Dale's grandfather's journal. Water too, it couldn't cross running streams. Those were our only advantages, and they didn't feel like much against something that could move faster than the eye could follow. We started by retracing our steps to the grove, where we'd seen the spiral-marked trees. The air felt heavier as we got closer, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Even the birds were silent now. As we moved deeper into the woods, we found something horrifying. A hollowed-out tree with objects stuffed inside. Clothes, shoes, watches, all belonging to people who had vanished over the years. Some of them looked decades old, others more recent. Dale stared at the tree for a long time before speaking. It's been feeding, he said quietly. I wanted to turn back right then and there, but I couldn't. Scout was still out there somewhere, or at least I hoped he was, and I wasn't going to leave him behind. We pressed on until we reached what felt like the heart of the forest. The trees here were twisted and unnatural, their branches forming shapes that looked almost human. It was like stepping into another world entirely. That's Seps when we saw it. The hollow walker stood in the center of the grove, its bark-like skin blending perfectly with the trees around it. It didn't move at first, just stood there, watching us with those hollow eyes. Then it spoke. Thomas. It wasn't just my wife's voice this time, it was dozens of voices all at once. Some I recognized from the radio the night before, others were unfamiliar but equally haunting. Dale stepped forward with his torch raised high, but before he could get too close, something changed in him. His body stiffened, his eyes glazed over, and he started walking toward the thing like he was in a trance. Dale, stop, I shouted, grabbing his arm and pulling him back. He snapped out of it just in time, shaking his head like he was waking from a bad dream. It sits in my head, he muttered, his voice trembling. I can hear it. The hollow walker moved then, fast and deliberate, jumping between trees until it was right in front of us. I lit my torch and swung it toward the thing, but it disappeared again before I could make contact. We retreated back toward a nearby stream, knowing it couldn't follow us across running water. But even as we caught our breath on the other side, I could feel its presence lingering just beyond the edge of the creek. It wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. And somehow, I knew what that was. That night, back at the cabin, Dale wasn't himself. He was quiet, too quiet, and his hands kept shaking no matter how hard he tried to hide it. I could tell something was wrong, but I didn't know how to fix it. He sat by the window, staring out into the darkness like he was waiting for something or someone. "It sips in my head," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can feel it pulling me." I wanted to tell him he was safe here, that the thing couldn't cross the stream near the cabin, but deep down I wasn't sure if that was true anymore. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps inside the cabin. At first I thought it was Dale moving around, but when I looked over at his cot, it was empty. "Dale." I called out, grabbing my flashlight and scanning the room. The furniture had been rearranged again, chairs flipped over, the desk pushed against the wall, and Dale's torch was lying on the floor near the door. I stepped outside and saw him standing at the edge of the forest. His back was to me, but something about the way he stood wasn't right. His movements were stiff, unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. "Dale," I shouted, running toward him. He turned slowly to face me, and my stomach dropped. His eyes weren't his anymore, they were dark and hollow, just like the thing we'd seen in the grove. "It wants a vessel," he said in a voice that wasn't his own. "It's Sep's tired of being bound to this forest." I backed away as he started walking toward me, his movements jerky and unnatural. "Stay back," I yelled, holding up my torch. But Dale, or whatever had taken over him, didn't stop. He lunged at me with surprising strength, knocking me to the ground and pinning me there. "You can stop it," he said through gritted teeth. "It's been waiting too long." I fought back as best as I could, using my torch to keep him from getting too close. The flame seemed to hurt him, or rather hurt whatever was controlling him, but it wasn't enough to drive it away completely. Finally, I managed to break free and run toward the stream behind the cabin. Dale followed me, or rather the thing inside him did, but stopped short at the water's edge. "It can't cross," I said out loud, more to myself than anyone else. But even as Dale stood there on the other side of the stream, staring at me with those hollow eyes, I knew this wasn't over. The hollow walker didn't just want Dale, it wanted me too. And somehow, it knew exactly how to get what it wanted. The next morning, I knew what I had to do. This thing wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. And it wasn't just Dale or me, it was everyone who wandered too close to Cold Creek. If I didn't end this now, more people would disappear. I spent hours going through Dale's grandfather's journal, searching for anything that could help. The ritual to bind the hollow walker was there, but it wasn't simple. It required a sacrifice, blood spilled at a sacred Cherokee site near the waterfall we'd found earlier. I packed what I needed and told Dale to stay behind. He was weak, barely able to speak, and I couldn't risk him getting hurt, or worse. Before I left, I opened my wife's journal and took one of her pressed flowers with me. It was a wild violet, delicate and beautiful despite the years it had spent flattened between the pages. I didn't know why I took it, but something told me it might help. The walk to the waterfall felt longer than it should have. The forest seemed to shift around me, the trees closing in tighter with every step. By the time I reached the cave near the falls, the air was so heavy it felt like I was breathing through water. The hollow walker was waiting for me. It stepped out from behind one of the ancient trees, its bark-like skin blending perfectly with the shadows, its limbs stretched unnaturally long, and its hollow eyes locked onto mine. "Thomas." It spoke in her voice again, my wife's voice, but this time it sounded clearer, almost real. "Come here." I held up the torch and stepped closer to the waterfall, keeping my back to the running water. The thing flinched slightly but didn't retreat. "I know what you are," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. "You've been feeding on people for centuries, but this ends now." The hollow walker tilted its head like it was studying me, then spoke again, this time in Dale's voice. "You can stop me," it said. "I am part of this forest." I didn't respond. Instead, I pulled out the wild violet and held it up for the thing to see. Its hollow eyes widened slightly as if it recognized what I was holding. "This is hers," I said softly. "You can have her." The thing lunged at me then, faster than I expected. I barely managed to swing my torch in time, the flames catching its bark-like skin and sending it stumbling back toward the trees. But it wasn't done yet. It started mimicking more voices. Dale's, Warren Mitchell's nephews, even Scout's bark, all overlapping in a horrifying chorus that made my head spin. I forced myself to focus on the ritual written in Dale's grandfather's journal. The steps were simple but brutal. Carve a spiral into the ground with blood and recite the binding words while standing in running water. I took out my hunting knife and sliced my palm open, letting the blood drip onto the dirt as I carved the spiral into the earth. The hollow walker screamed, a sound that shook the trees around me, but it didn't stop me. As I recited the words from the journal, the thing lunged at me one last time, but this time it couldn't reach me. The waterfall acted as a barrier, keeping it from crossing into my space. Finally, with one last scream, it vanished into thin air. The forest went silent again. I collapsed by the stream, exhausted but alive. The ritual had worked. The hollow walker was bound again, but at what cost? When I returned to the cabin later that day, Dale was gone. His cot was empty, his gear untouched. It was like he'd never been there at all. And Scout? He never came back either. My name is Catherine Donovan, but everyone calls me Kate. I'm a park ranger stationed at Glacier National Park in Montana. It's a beautiful place, but it can be brutal too, especially in winter. The snow piles high, the temperatures drop low, and sometimes you feel like the world has forgotten you exist. That's why I'm here, alone, at the Granite Peak outpost. I wasn't always this isolated. I used to be part of search and rescue teams, one of the best, if I'm being honest. But things changed after a mission went wrong. A young hiker didn't make it, and I couldn't save him. I still hear his voice sometimes, calling for help in my dreams. That failure left me with scars, physical ones too. My leg never healed right after that fall, so now I walk with a limp and live with constant pain. After the accident, I transferred here to get away from everything. The noise, the people, the memories. It's just me now, surrounded by snow-covered mountains and endless silence. Well, not entirely silent. I've got my radios to keep me company. I've always been good with communications equipment. It's something I picked up during my time in the Army. Vietnam-era tech taught me how to fix just about anything that transmits a signal. The radios are my lifeline out here. They connect me to headquarters and other stations when the weather isn't too bad. I've even modified some of them to pick up unusual frequencies, just for fun, or maybe out of habit from my old search and rescue days. You'd be surprised what you can hear if you know where to listen. Faint conversations from far-off places, strange bursts of static that sound almost alive. Tonight feels different though. There's a storm coming. A big one, and I've been preparing all day. Stocking supplies, testing equipment, making sure everything is secure before the snow traps me here for weeks on end. The last radio check with headquarters was shaky. The signal kept cutting in and out like something was interfering. Could be the solar flares they've been warning us about lately. They've been messing with communications all over the world. As I sit by the radio now, watching the wind pick up outside, I feel uneasy. It's not just the storm or the isolation. It's something else, something I can't quite put my finger on. The air feels heavier somehow, like it's holding its breath before something happens. I glance at my pocket voice recorder sitting on the desk next to me. It's become a habit to document anything unusual out here. Odd sounds on the radio, strange patterns in the snow, wildlife behaving strangely. Sometimes it feels like this place has secrets it doesn't want to share but can't help leaking out in bits and pieces. I press record and speak into it softly. Ranger Catherine Donovan, Granite Peak Outpost, November 12th. Preparing for incoming storm, radio interference detected on multiple frequencies, possible anomaly. I pause and look out the window again as shadows from the trees sway in the wind like ghostly figures dancing in the dark. Something tells me this winter is going to be different. The storm hit harder than I expected. By the time I crawled into bed that night, the wind was howling like a pack of wolves, rattling the windows and shaking the walls of the outpost. It felt like the whole building might just up and take off into the blizzard. I must have fallen asleep at some point because I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't the wind or the creaking of the cabin. it was something else. A faint hum, almost like a high-pitched whistle, was coming from my radio equipment. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. 3:17 a.m. The hum grew louder, and before I could even sit up, every piece of electronic equipment in the outpost turned on all at once. The emergency radio crackled to life, spitting out static and garbled voices. The old television in the corner flickered on, showing nothing but snow-white static dancing across the screen. Even my pocket voice recorder, which I'd left on my desk, started playing back something, but it wasn't my voice. I threw off my blanket and limped over to the desk, heart pounding in my chest. The recorder was playing a series of numbers, softly at first, then louder and louder until it felt like they were echoing inside my skull. 73142. I grabbed it and hit stop, but it wouldn't turn off. The numbers kept playing faster now, overlapping each other until it was just noise, chaotic and overwhelming. Finally, I yanked out the batteries, and everything went silent again. I stood there for a moment, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it was some kind of power surge? The storm messing with the electronics? That had to be it, right? But then I noticed something outside the window, a faint glow in the distance. It wasn't lightning or headlights. It was something else entirely. I grabbed my coat and flashlight and stepped out into the freezing night air. The snow was falling thick and fast, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. As I approached where I'd seen the glow, my flashlight beam landed on something that made my stomach drop. A circle of dead animals, rabbits, foxes, even a deer, lay perfectly arranged in the snow. Their bodies were untouched except for strange burn marks on their fur and skin, like tiny circuit board patterns etched into them. I backed away slowly, my breath fogging up in front of me, as panic began to creep in. This wasn't normal. This wasn't natural. I turned and hurried back to the outpost, locking the door behind me, as if that would somehow keep whatever this was outside where it belonged. My hands were shaking as I reached for my voice recorder again, batteries back in place, and pressed record. Ranger Catherine Donovan, Granite Peak Outpost, November 13th, 3:45 a.m. Unexplained power surge, radio interference, found dead wildlife outside station, burn patterns observed. I stopped recording and sat there in silence for what felt like hours, listening to the wind battering against the walls. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just the storm making me feel this way. Something else was out there. The next morning, the storm hadn't let up. The snow was coming down so hard that it felt like the outpost was being swallowed whole. I couldn't shake the unease from last night. The hum, the numbers, the dead animals. It all felt wrong, but I needed to stay focused. I told myself there had to be a logical explanation for everything. I started my day by documenting what I'd seen. I took my notebook and wrote down every detail. The time, the sounds, the strange burn marks on the animals. Writing things out always helped me think clearly, like putting pieces of a puzzle together. After that, I decided to check my radio equipment again. The interference from last night was still there, a faint crackling sound on almost every frequency. But as I turned the dial slowly, something caught my attention. It wasn't static this time, it was a voice. Mayday. Mayday. This is Delta Base, coordinates 731. The signal was weak and broken, like it was coming from far away, or maybe from another time. My heart skipped a beat when I recognized part of the message, those same numbers from my voice recorder last night. I grabbed an old map of the park and started searching for anything marked Delta Base. There was nothing on the current map, but then I remembered a box of old documents stored in the supply closet, maps, reports, and other paperwork from decades ago. It took me over an hour to dig through the dusty files, but eventually I found what I was looking for, an outdated map of Glacier National Park from the 1970s. Sure enough, there it was. Delta Base marked deep in the northern part of the park, near an area that had been closed off for years due to environmental hazards. I stared at the map, trying to make sense of it all. Why wasn't this base on any of the newer maps? And why would a signal from there suddenly show up now? Before I could think too much about it, another strange thing happened. My flashlight, which had been sitting untouched on the desk, flickered on by itself. The beam pointed directly at my pocket voice recorder as if something wanted me to pick it up. I hesitated, but eventually pressed play. At first there was nothing but static. Then faintly, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Kate. It was my name, spoken softly but clearly, and then silence again. I dropped the recorder, like it had burned me, and backed away from the desk. My breathing was shallow, and my hands were trembling. This wasn't just radio interference or some glitchy equipment anymore. Something or someone was trying to reach me. I forced myself to calm down and think rationally. Maybe someone else out here in the park needed help. A stranded hiker or a researcher caught in the storm. That had to be it. But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. I bundled up and prepared to head outside again, despite the worsening weather. If there were answers out there, I needed to find them. The storm hadn't let up, and by mid-afternoon, the outpost felt like it was buried under a mountain of snow. I was flipping through old maps and notes, trying to figure out how I could reach the location marked as Delta Base. The weather made it impossible to leave now, but I couldn't stop thinking about the signal I'd picked up earlier. That steps when I heard the knock. It was faint at first, just a soft tapping against the door, but then it grew louder, more insistent. My heart jumped into my throat. No one should be out here in this weather, not unless they were desperate or lost. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously opened the door. Standing there, covered in snow and shivering, was a man I didn't recognize. He looked older, maybe in his late 50s, with a thick beard and tired eyes. "Ranger Donovan?" he asked, his voice shaky from the cold. "Yeah," I replied, still holding the flashlight like a weapon. "Who are you?" "Dr. Martin Reynolds," he said quickly. "He meteorologist, studying storm patterns in the area." I hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. He looked harmless enough, but something about him felt off. Once inside, Reynolds warmed his hands over the small heater while explaining why he was here. He claimed he'd been tracking electromagnetic anomalies across the region, strange signals and interference patterns that seemed tied to the recent solar flares. "I've seen this before," he said quietly, almost to himself, "years ago in other places." I raised an eyebrow at that, but didn't press him for details yet. Instead, I offered him some coffee and asked how he'd managed to find me in this weather. "I followed the signal," he admitted. "Your outpost is broadcasting something unusual, something I've been tracking for weeks." That's when my modified radio equipment crackled to life again. Reynolds froze, staring at it like he'd seen a ghost. The static wasn't random anymore. It was shifting, almost like it was forming shapes or patterns on its own. "It's here," Reynolds whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise. "What's here?" I demanded, feeling my stomach tighten with fear. Before he could answer, there was a sudden power surge that made every light in the cabin flicker wildly. The emergency television turned on again, showing nothing but static, but this time I saw it clearly, a shadowy figure moving within the static itself. It looked humanoid, but distorted, like it was made entirely of shifting white noise. Reynolds backed away from the screen as if it might reach out and grab him. "Don't look directly at it," he warned sharply. "It can sense you through electronic devices." I didn't know what to believe anymore. This man's cryptic warnings or my own eyes. But one thing was clear. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't natural. Reynolds sat across from me at the small table in the outpost, his hands wrapped tightly around the steaming mug of coffee I'd given him. He hadn't said much since the power surge or the appearance of that shadowy figure in the static. I could tell he was holding something back, and I wasn't about to let it go. "What do you mean it's here?" I asked, keeping my voice steady even though my nerves were anything but. Reynolds stared into his coffee like it held all the answers. Finally, he sighed and looked up at me. "I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you sooner." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper as if the walls themselves might be listening. "Back in 1972, I was part of a classified military experiment called Project Blackwave. We were trying to develop a new kind of communication system, something that could transmit signals across impossible distances using electromagnetic frequencies." I frowned. trying to piece together what he was saying. What does that have to do with what SIP's happening here? Reynolds hesitated before continuing. We didn't just create a new communication system. We opened something, a gateway. If you want to call it that, we didn't know it at the time, but we tapped into frequencies that don't belong to our world. I felt a chill run down my spine. What came through? Reynolds took a deep breath and said the words I'd been dreading, an entity. Something that exists partially in the electromagnetic spectrum but can interact with our world through electronic devices. I shook my head, refusing to believe it. You saying this static figure is from another dimension? Not exactly, Reynolds replied grimly. It's always been here just outside our perception. We gave it a way in. I sat back in my chair trying to process what he was telling me. It sounded insane, like something out of a science fiction movie. But after everything I'd seen and heard over the past few days, I couldn't dismiss it entirely. What happened to the experiment? I asked cautiously. Reynolds' expression darkened. The entity started attacking us, absorbing electrical energy and even bioelectricity from people who got too close. We shut down Blackwave and covered up what happened, blaming equipment failures and lightning strikes for the casualties. And now it's here, I said quietly, feeling the weight of those words settle over me like a heavy blanket. Reynolds nodded solemnly. It's been following patterns, communication tower failures, strange signals during storms, and now it's found its way to you. I felt my stomach twist as his words sank in. The interference on my radios, the numbers on my recorder, the shadowy figure in the static, it was all connected to this entity he'd unleashed decades ago. What does it want? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Reynolds hesitated before answering. Energy, power, and eventually, the hours dragged on with the storm outside growing fiercer by the minute. Reynolds and I worked to reinforce the outpost, blocking windows and securing doors, but deep down I knew it wouldn't be enough. Whatever this thing was, it didn't need to break through walls to get to us. It could move through the airwaves, the wires, anything connected to power. Reynolds had been quiet for a while, scribbling notes in his journal, and occasionally glancing at my modified radio equipment. I could tell he was trying to stay calm, but his hands shook every time the static on the emergency television flickered. Then it happened. The lights dimmed suddenly, and the hum returned. The same high-pitched whistle I'd heard the night before. It wasn't coming from one device this time, it was everywhere. The radios crackled, the television buzzed, even my flashlight flickered erratically. Reynolds stood up abruptly, his face pale. "It's here," he said, his voice trembling. Before I could respond, the emergency television screen turned completely black for a moment, and then the static returned. But this time it wasn't just noise. The shadowy figure appeared again, clearer than before, its humanoid shape shifting and twisting like it was struggling to hold itself together. I froze in place as the figure seemed to turn toward us, or at least its head-like shape did. The static grew louder, almost deafening, and then Reynolds screamed. I turned just in time to see him clutching his chest as sparks of electricity danced across his body. His face contorted in pain as he fell to his knees, and I realized what was happening. The entity was draining him, pulling energy from his body, like a parasite feeding on its host. "Get out," Reynolds gasped, barely able to speak as he collapsed to the floor. I grabbed my flashlight and pocket voice recorder and ran toward the door, but before I could reach it, the entity's form shifted again, stretching out like tendrils of static reaching for me. The hum grew louder in my ears, making it impossible to think clearly. Reynolds' Sepp's voice cut through the chaos one last time. "Faraday cage, it can get through." His words snapped me back to reality. I remembered reading about Faraday cages during my army training, structures that block electromagnetic fields. My radio equipment was partially shielded that way. Maybe it would be enough to hold off the entity for now. I scrambled toward the desk where my radios were set up and ducked behind it as the tendrils of static closed in around me. The hum grew louder still until it felt like my skull might split open. But then everything stopped. The entity couldn't reach me here. Not yet. But Reynolds was gone. I stayed crouched behind the desk for what felt like hours, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The hum was gone now, and the outpost was eerily quiet except for the sound of the wind battering the walls outside. Reynolds was dead. I didn't want to look at his body, but I could feel his absence like a hole in the room. He'd warned me about the Faraday cage, and he'd been right. This small, shielded corner of my setup had kept me safe. But I knew it wouldn't last. I needed a plan. First, I checked my supplies. My tools were scattered across the desk: spare wires, batteries, and old soldering iron. I grabbed anything that might help me rig up some kind of defense. My army training kicked in as I worked, my hands moving almost automatically while my mind raced to keep up. I started by reinforcing the shielding around my radio equipment, wrapping wires and metal mesh around anything that could block electromagnetic fields. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. Next, I turned my attention to detection. If this thing could move through frequencies, then maybe I could track it before it got too close. I modified one of my radios to pick up even the faintest shifts in static, tiny changes that might signal the entity's presence. As I worked, I couldn't stop thinking about what Reynolds had said before he died. It's been following patterns. That meant this thing wasn't just some random force of nature, it had a purpose. And if it had a purpose, maybe it had weaknesses too. I flipped through Reynolds' Sipshu journal, scanning his notes for anything useful. Most of it was technical jargon about electromagnetic waves and signal interference, but one phrase stood out: vulnerable to frequency disruptions. Frequency disruptions. That gave me an idea. I grabbed an old emergency transmitter from the storage closet and started tinkering with it. If I could create a strong enough signal at just the right frequency, maybe I could disrupt the entity long enough to escape or even drive it back entirely. The storm outside raged on as I worked, but inside, everything felt calm and focused. For the first time in days, I felt like I had some control over the situation, like I wasn't just waiting for this thing to come and take me too. But then something caught my eye. A faint flicker on one of the radios. The static shifted ever so slightly, like a whisper just out of reach. My makeshift detector was picking up something nearby. It was coming back. The static on the radio grew louder, shifting between bursts of noise and faint whispers. I knew the entity was close, too close, but I had to keep working. My hands moved quickly as I adjusted the emergency transmitter, trying to fine-tune the frequency that might disrupt the entity's presence. I glanced at the window, but all I could see was snow swirling in the storm. It felt like the world outside didn't exist anymore, like the outpost was floating in some endless void. The hum returned, faint at first, but steadily growing louder. I set the transmitter to broadcast and flipped the switch. The machine whirred to life, sending out a pulse of sound that made my ears ring. For a moment, everything went quiet. The static disappeared and the hum faded. I thought it might have worked. But then the lights flickered violently and the emergency television turned on again. This time, the shadowy figure wasn't just shifting in the static. It was fully formed, standing in the center of the screen like it was staring right at me. Kate. It spoke my name in a distorted voice that sent chills down my spine. The sound wasn't human. It was layered, like dozens of voices speaking at once. I stumbled back from the desk as the figure began to move. Not just on the screen, but through it. Tendrils of static stretched out from the television, snaking across the floor toward me. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it wildly, but it passed right through them like smoke. The backup generator sputtered and died, plunging the outpost into darkness, except for the glow of static from every screen and device around me. My defenses were failing one by one, and I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I grabbed my coat and ran for the door, but as soon as I stepped outside, I realized how bad things had gotten. The storm was worse than ever, blinding snow and freezing wind tearing through the air. But that wasn't what stopped me in my tracks. The entity was out here too. Its form flickered in and out of existence, moving through the snow like a ghost made of static. It didn't need walls or wires anymore. It had grown stronger, feeding off Reynolds and absorbing energy from everything around it. I tried to run, but my injured leg slowed me down. The pain shot through me with every step as I stumbled into the blizzard, clutching my flashlight like it was my last lifeline. The hum followed me everywhere I went, growing louder until it drowned out even my own thoughts. That's when I felt it, the pull in my chest like something tugging at me from inside. My medical implant. Reynolds had warned me about this connection before he died. The entity wasn't just hunting me, it was inside me now. The storm was relentless, and every step felt like a battle against the wind and snow. My injured leg throbbed with pain, but I couldn't stop, not now. The hum was louder than ever, vibrating deep in my chest like it was trying to pull me apart from the inside. I clutched the old map tightly in my frozen hands, following the faint markings toward the abandoned military bunker Reynolds had mentioned in his notes. If I could reach the original Project Blackwave equipment, maybe I could stop this thing or at least send it back to wherever it came from. The bunker finally came into view, half buried in snow and ice. It looked ancient, its metal doors rusted and barely holding together under the weight of years of neglect. I forced them open with all the strength I had left and stumbled inside, slamming them shut behind me. The air inside was cold and stale, but it was quiet, almost too quiet. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the room. Old computers and equipment lined the walls, covered in dust and cobwebs. In the center of the room was a large transmitter, the heart of Project Blackwave. I limped over to it and began working as quickly as I could. The controls were old but familiar enough for me to understand. I needed to reverse the frequency gateway to send this entity back to wherever it had come from before it grew strong enough to reach a populated area. The hum returned, louder than ever, and I knew I didn't have much time. The entity was here, inside the bunker with me. Static flickered across the screens, and tendrils of white noise began creeping along the floor like living shadows. I felt the pull in my chest again, stronger now, and realized what was happening. My medical implant was acting like a beacon for the entity, drawing it closer with every passing second. It wasn't just hunting me, it was feeding off me. I gritted my teeth and kept working, forcing myself to stay focused despite the pain and fear threatening to overwhelm me. The transmitter whirred to life as I adjusted the frequency settings, searching for the exact range that would disrupt the entity's connection to this world. The static grew thicker, swirling around me like a storm within a storm. The entity's form began to materialize fully now. A humanoid figure made entirely of shifting white noise, its face staring directly at me. "Kate," it whispered again, its voice echoing in my mind. I ignored it and flipped the final switch on the transmitter. The machine roared to life, sending out a pulse of sound so powerful that it shook the entire bunker. The entity screamed, a distorted cry that made every hair on my body stand on end, and began to dissolve into static. But something went wrong. The connection between my implant and the entity was too strong. As it collapsed back into its frequency gateway, I felt myself being pulled along with it, my consciousness merging with its chaotic energy for just a moment. In that instant, I saw everything: the entity's origin, its endless hunger for energy, its existence beyond human understanding, and then darkness. When I woke up, the world was quiet. The storm was gone, and so was the hum. I was lying on the cold metal floor of the bunker, surrounded by broken equipment and the faint smell of burnt wires. My head throbbed and my body felt like it had been torn apart and stitched back together. I sat up slowly, wincing as my injured leg protested. The transmitter was destroyed, completely fried, but the static was gone. The entity, it was gone too. I wasn't sure how long I'd been unconscious, but when I stepped outside, the snow had stopped falling. The sky was clear, painted in soft shades of pink and orange as the sun rose over the mountains. It felt surreal, like waking up from a nightmare that left its mark on reality. A search team found me 2 days later after I managed to repair an old emergency beacon in the bunker. They were shocked to find me alive, especially after hearing about the storm and seeing the state of the outpost when they arrived. I didn't tell them everything. How could I? Who would believe me if I said I'd faced something that lived in static and shadows? Instead, I told them there'd been a power surge, that Dr. Reynolds had died in an accident, and that I'd taken shelter in the bunker when things got out of control. They accepted my story without question, but something strange happened during my medical examination back at headquarters. The doctors couldn't explain it, but my old injury, The one that had left me with chronic pain and a limp was gone. My leg had somehow healed completely, as if it had never been broken in the first place. And then there were the electronics. Radios crackled to life whenever I walked into a room, even if they weren't plugged in. Static followed me everywhere, soft whispers on frequencies no one else could hear. I tried to move on with my life after that winter, but part of me knew I'd never really escape what happened at Granite Peak. Sometimes, during storms, I hear my voice on the radio calling out from somewhere far away. And sometimes, I think it sits still watching me. My name is Malcolm Westbrook. I'm a park ranger here at Yellowstone National Park. It's a quiet life, just me, the trees, and the wildlife. That's exactly what I wanted when I requested this post. After everything I've been through, the war, my failed marriages, and losing touch with my son, I needed somewhere far away from people. Out here, no one asks questions. No one looks at me like I'm broken. It was early fall, and the park was alive with color. The trees were golden and red, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. The air was crisp, but not too cold, and the sky stretched endlessly above me, a perfect blue. I was out on patrol in one of the park's more remote areas, riding my horse, Scout. This part of Yellowstone doesn't see many visitors. It's rugged and wild, with rocky cliffs and deep forests that seem to go on forever. As I rode through a meadow surrounded by towering ponderosa pines, I felt a rare moment of peace. The only sounds were Scout's hooves, crunching against the dirt trail, and the occasional chirp of a bird overhead. I stopped for a moment to jot down some notes in my logbook, just routine stuff about wildlife sightings and trail conditions. But something caught my eye in the distance. There was an abandoned campsite just off the trail. The tent was still standing, but it looked like no one had been there for days. A campfire pit was filled with cold ash, and there were scraps of half-eaten food scattered around. It didn't feel right. Campers are supposed to clean up after themselves, especially in a place like this where bears roam freely. I dismounted Scout and walked over to take a closer look. The ground around the campsite was trampled, but not in a way that made sense. There were footprints, human ones, but they were strange. They looked like they were facing backward. I frowned and looked around. The forest suddenly felt different, quieter somehow. No birds chirping anymore. No rustling leaves or buzzing insects. Just silence. The sun was starting to set by then, casting long shadows across the meadow. I decided it was time to head back to my cabin before it got dark. As Scout and I made our way through the forest trails, that eerie silence followed us all the way home. When I finally reached my cabin, a small wooden structure tucked away in the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. But I told myself it was just my imagination running wild after seeing those strange footprints. That night, as I sat by the fireplace with a cup of coffee in hand, I tried to focus on reading an old book about local wildlife, but every so often I'd glance at the window behind me, half expecting to see something staring back. I didn't sleep much that night. That night, something woke me up. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. I just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening. The cabin was quiet except for the faint crackle of the dying fire in the hearth. But then I heard it again, a sound outside. It was faint, like someone walking through the forest just beyond the cabin. I sat up in bed and reached for my service revolver on the nightstand. My heart was pounding, but I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer wandering too close to the cabin. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I got up slowly and walked to the window. The moonlight lit up the clearing outside, casting long shadows from the trees. I didn't see anything at first, just Scout tied up near the small shed where I kept my supplies. But then I noticed he was acting strange. His ears were pinned back and he kept stomping his hooves nervously. "Easy boy," I whispered under my breath. And then I heard it, a voice. A woman's voice calling my name from somewhere in the darkness. Malcolm. I froze. My blood ran cold because I recognized that voice. It sounded exactly like my ex-wife, Sarah, but that didn't make any sense. Sarah was in Chicago, hundreds of miles away from here. "Malcolm, come outside," the voice called again, softer this time. I backed away from the window, gripping my revolver tightly. My hands were shaking now. There was no way it could be her. No way at all. The voice came again, closer this time. "Malcolm, please." I wanted to believe it wasn't real, that maybe I was dreaming or hearing things because I hadn't slept well in days. But then Scout let out a loud whinny and started pulling against his tether like he was trying to break free. I turned away from the window and sat down on the edge of my bed, trying to calm myself down. But then something else happened. Something even worse. The radio on my desk crackled to life with static. It shouldn't have been on. I'd turned it off before going to bed. But now it was buzzing and hissing like someone was trying to tune into a station. And through the static, I thought I heard faint whispers. "Help me," a voice said through the static. I grabbed the radio and turned it off completely, yanking out the power cord for good measure. My breathing was shallow now, and every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stay inside and lock the door. But then came the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, right outside my cabin door. I pointed my revolver at the door and waited, barely daring to breathe. The footsteps stopped just outside, and for a moment, there was silence again. And then a knock. 3 slow knocks on the wooden door. I didn't answer. My finger tightened on the trigger as I stared at that door, waiting for whatever or whoever it was to make its next move. But nothing happened after that knock. No more footsteps, no voices, just silence again. I stayed up all night after that, sitting in a chair by the door with my gun in hand. Whatever had been out there didn't come back, or if it did, it stayed quiet enough that I couldn't hear it. By morning, I told myself it must have been some kind of prank, or maybe even just my imagination playing tricks on me after seeing those strange footprints earlier in the day. But deep down, I knew better. Something wasn't set right in these woods. The next morning, I stepped outside the cabin with Scout still tied up nearby. He looked calmer now, but kept glancing toward the tree line like he was expecting something to jump out. I patted his neck to reassure him, though I wasn't feeling very reassured myself. The first thing I noticed was the ground around the cabin. There were footprints, human footprints, but they were all facing backward again, just like the ones I'd seen at the abandoned campsite. They circled the cabin, stopping right at the door where I'd heard the knock last night. I crouched down to get a closer look. The prints were deep, like whoever made them had been standing there for a while, but there was something else, something that made my stomach turn. The air smelled foul, like rotting meat mixed with sulfur. It was faint, but unmistakable. I didn't have much time to think about it because I had to start my patrol for the day. But before leaving, I grabbed my logbook and wrote everything down, the footprints, the smell, and even the voice I'd heard last night. I wasn't sure if anyone would believe me, but I needed to keep a record of it all. As Scout and I rode deeper into the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The trees seemed taller today, their shadows longer and darker than usual. Even the birds were quieter than normal, their songs replaced by an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. About an hour into my patrol, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks, a dead elk lying in a clearing. At first glance, it looked like a predator had gotten to it, maybe a bear or a wolf, but as I got closer, I realized this was no ordinary kill. The elk's body had been torn open with surgical precision. Its ribs were exposed and its organs were missing, but there wasn't a single drop of blood on the ground around it. It was as if something had drained it completely before leaving it here. I dismounted Scout and took a few steps closer, covering my nose with my sleeve to block out the stench of decay. That same sulfuric smell from earlier hung heavy in the air. "What in the world?" I muttered under my breath. "Skin taker," a voice said behind me. I spun around so fast, I nearly dropped my revolver. Standing there was an old man, Native American by his features, holding a small bundle of herbs in one hand and a walking stick in the other. He had long gray hair tied back in a braid and wore a weathered jacket that looked older than me. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Anthony Blackhawk," he said simply. "Shoshone." I nodded slowly. What did you just say? Skin taker? He pointed at the elk Sep's body with his walking stick. That Sep's not an animal Sep's work, he said quietly. Something else did this. What do you mean? What kind of something Sep's? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he crouched down next to the elk and muttered something in his native language under his breath. Some kind of prayer or blessing, maybe. When he stood up again, he looked me straight in the eye. You Sep not safe here, he said. I frowned at him. What are you talking about? What Sep's going on? He hesitated for a moment before finally speaking again. Their Sep's an old legend, he said slowly. A creature that can take on any form it wants, man or beast. It walks among us wearing stolen faces but leaves behind signs if you know where to look. I thought about the footprints around my cabin and felt a chill run down my spine. What does it want? I asked. To feed, he said simply. Before I could ask him anything else, he turned and started walking away into the trees without another word. I stood there for a long time after he left, staring at the elk's mutilated body and wondering if maybe this old man knew more than he was letting on, or if he was just trying to scare me for some reason. Either way, something about his words stuck with me. You're not safe here. That night, I was still thinking about what Anthony Blackhawk had said. His words kept replaying in my mind. You're not safe here. I didn't know if I believed him, but after everything I'd seen, the footprints, the elk, the voice outside my cabin, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I radioed headquarters earlier in the day to report the strange activity. They didn't seem too concerned, but agreed to send another ranger out to assist me. His name was Timothy Foster, a younger guy who'd only been working here for a couple of years. He was supposed to arrive at my cabin around sunset. When Foster showed up, I felt a little better knowing I wasn't alone anymore. But there was something about him that seemed off. He wasn't acting like himself. Normally, Foster was talkative and easygoing, but tonight he was quiet, almost too quiet. He kept staring at me like he was trying to figure something out. You all right? I asked him, as we sat by the fireplace. Yeah, he said quickly, but his voice sounded strange, flat, and emotionless. I tried to brush it off as nerves. Maybe he was just spooked by the report I'd given earlier about the elk and the footprints. But then he said something that made my stomach drop. Remember what you told me last week? He asked. I frowned at him. What are you talking about? I haven't seen you in over a month. He stared at me for a long moment before smiling, a slow, unnatural smile that didn't reach his eyes. That aspect, when I knew something was wrong. I stood up and grabbed my revolver from the table. Foster, I said carefully. What Sep's going on? He didn't answer. Instead, he stood up too, moving slowly like he didn't want to scare me. But there was something about the way he moved. It wasn't normal. His steps were too smooth, too deliberate, like he was mimicking how a person should walk. And then I saw it. His eyes weren't right. They looked human at first glance, but when the firelight hit them just right, they reflected back like an animal's eyes. Who are you? I demanded, pointing my gun at him. He tilted his head to one side and smiled again, a smile that sent chills down my spine. You already know, he said softly. Before I could react, he lunged at me with inhuman speed. I fired a shot, but it barely slowed him down. He grabbed me by the arm and threw me across the room like I weighed nothing. My back hit the wall hard enough to knock the wind out of me. The cabin door flew open as Scout broke free from his tether outside and bolted into the woods screaming in terror. The creature, because there was no way this thing was Foster anymore, turned toward me again, its movements jerky and unnatural now that it wasn't trying to hide what it really was. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed the silver letter opener from my desk, the only weapon within reach. As the creature lunged at me again, I swung wildly and managed to stab it in the shoulder. It let out a scream, a horrible sound that echoed through the forest like dozens of voices crying out at once, and stumbled backward toward the open door. The fire in the hearth flared up suddenly, casting wild shadows across the room as the creature turned and fled into the night. Its footsteps sounded heavy at first, but quickly faded into silence as it disappeared into the trees. I stood there shaking, clutching the letter opener tightly in one hand while blood dripped from a cut on my forehead where I'd hit the wall earlier. The cabin smelled like sulfur now, stronger than before, and smoke from the fireplace filled the air as flames licked dangerously close to the wooden walls. I grabbed my logbook and ran outside just as part of the roof collapsed behind me in a burst of sparks and flames. The cabin was gone, but so was Foster's body. Whatever that thing had been, it wasn't human anymore. The next morning, I woke up slumped against a tree near the ruins of my cabin. My body ached all over, and my head was pounding. The fire had burned itself out overnight, leaving behind nothing but charred wood and blackened earth. I sat there for a while, staring at the wreckage and trying to piece together what had happened. Foster, or whatever that thing was gone. The only sign of him was the blood stain on the floor where I'd stabbed him with the silver letter opener. I still had the blade in my hand, its edge stained dark from the creature's blood. I didn't know why it had worked, but it had hurt him. Hurt it. That meant it could be killed. I couldn't just leave. Not now. Whatever this thing was, it was dangerous. If it wasn't stopped, more people could die. I decided then and there that I was going to track it down. I saddled up Scout. Thankfully, he hadn't gone far after breaking loose, and rode out into the forest. The air was colder today, and the sky was overcast, casting everything in a dull gray light. The trees seemed darker too, their branches twisting together like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. It didn't take long to find the trail. The creature's footprints were easy to spot. They were human-shaped but facing backward, just like before. They led deeper into the forest, away from any of the main trails or campsites. As I followed the tracks, I started noticing other things too. The trees around me looked wrong. Their trunks were warped and gnarled, and their bark was covered in strange symbols carved deep into the wood. I didn't recognize them, but they gave me an uneasy feeling like they were watching me somehow. Then there were the animals, or what was left of them. Dead birds littered the ground in some places, their bodies arranged in strange patterns that made no sense. A deer carcass hung from a low branch at one point, its eyes wide open and staring blankly ahead. The smell of sulfur grew stronger as I went further in. By midday, I reached an old mining tunnel, hidden in a rocky hillside. The footprints led straight inside. The entrance was dark and narrow, with rusted metal beams barely holding up the crumbling rock above it. A cold wind blew out from the tunnel's mouth, carrying with it that same foul stench of decay. I dismounted Scout and tied him to a tree nearby. He didn't want to stay. He kept pulling against the reins and snorting nervously, but I couldn't risk taking him inside with me. Before going in, I heard someone call my name again. Malcolm. It came from somewhere behind me this time. A soft whisper carried on the wind. I turned around quickly but saw nothing except trees swaying gently in the breeze. "Get a hold of yourself," I muttered under my breath. I took a deep breath and stepped into the tunnel. Inside, it was cold and damp. Water dripped from the ceiling in some places, forming shallow puddles on the uneven floor. The walls were lined with old wooden supports that creaked ominously with every step I took. The deeper I went, the worse it got. The smell was almost unbearable. Now, thick and cloying like something had been rotting down here for years. And then I saw them. Bones scattered across the floor in piles. Some were animal bones, deer antlers, bear skulls, but others were unmistakably human. My stomach churned as I knelt down to examine one of the piles more closely. Among the bones was a rusted pocket knife with initials carved into its handle. JT. It must have belonged to one of the missing hikers who'd vanished in this area over the years. This thing had been hunting here for a long time. As I stood up again, something moved in the shadows ahead of me, a flicker of motion just at the edge of my vision. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing through the tunnel. No answer. Just silence. I gripped my revolver tightly and took another step forward when suddenly Anthony Blackhawk appeared out of nowhere beside me. He was holding an obsidian blade in one hand and a small pouch in the other. "You shouldn't have come here alone," he said quietly. I nearly jumped out of my skin but managed to keep my voice steady. "What are you doing here?" "I followed you," he said simply. "You're going to need this." He handed me the obsidian blade and opened his pouch to reveal some kind of powder or ash inside. "What is this?" I asked him. "Protection," he said cryptically before closing the pouch again. "But it won't last long." Before I could ask him anything else, he motioned for me to follow him deeper into the tunnel. Whatever we were walking toward, it wasn't going to be good. The tunnel seemed endless. Every step we took echoed around us, bouncing off the damp stone walls. Anthony Blackhawk walked ahead of me, his movements steady and deliberate, while I followed close behind with the obsidian blade in one hand and my revolver in the other. The air was colder now, and the smell of sulfur was so strong it made my eyes water. "Are you sure we're going the right way?" I asked him. He didn't turn around, but nodded. "It seps here." "What is set? It's spet." I pressed. "You shall see," he said quietly. I didn't like that answer. My nerves were already shot, and my heart felt like it was beating out of my chest. But I kept moving forward because there was no turning back now. After what felt like hours, we reached a large, open chamber deep inside the tunnel. The walls were covered in those same strange symbols I'd seen carved into the trees earlier, but these were bigger and more detailed. They seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, casting eerie shadows across the room. In the center of the chamber was a pile of bones, human and animal mixed together, and standing over them was something that made my blood run cold. The creature wasn't human anymore, not even close. Its skin hung loosely from its body like it didn't fit right, and its limbs were too long and thin, bending at unnatural angles. Its face was a twisted mess of features that looked like they'd been stitched together from different people, eyes that didn't match, a crooked nose, a mouth that stretched far too wide. As we stepped into the chamber, it turned to look at us. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I felt frozen in place, unable to move or even breathe. "Malcolm," it said in a voice that wasn't its own. It sounded like my father's voice, the same voice I hadn't heard since he died years ago. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to speak. "You stir not him." The creature smiled, a slow, horrible smile that stretched across its misshapen face. "But I know him," it said. "I know everything about you." I glanced at Anthony, hoping he had some kind of plan, but he was already moving forward toward the creature with his pouch of ash in hand. He started chanting something in his native language, a low, rhythmic sound that echoed through the chamber like a heartbeat. The creature screamed, a sound so loud and piercing it felt like it could shatter stone, and lunged at Anthony with impossible speed. He didn't flinch but threw the ash from his pouch directly at its face. The creature recoiled, its skin bubbling and smoking where the ash had touched it, but then it turned its attention back to me. "You can hide from me," it said in another voice, this time my own voice, distorted and wrong. "I see everything." Suddenly, images flooded my mind, memories I'd tried to bury for years. The war came rushing back all at once. The sounds of gunfire, the screams of men dying around me, the things I'd done to survive, things I wasn't proud of. I stumbled backward as the creature's psychic assault overwhelmed me. It knew everything, every mistake I'd ever made, every regret I carried with me, and it used them against me like weapons. "Malcolm," Anthony shouted as he threw me the obsidian blade. "It seems vulnerable now. You have to strike." I gripped the blade tightly and forced myself to focus. The creature was still screaming and writhing from Anthony's attack with the ash, its true form starting to emerge as its stolen faces melted away. It looked at me one last time before lunging forward again, its twisted limbs reaching for me. I didn't hesitate this time. I plunged the obsidian blade straight into its chest. The creature let out one final scream, a sound so loud it shook the entire chamber, and then collapsed onto the pile of bones beneath it. Its body convulsed for a moment before going still completely. But Anthony, he didn't make it. In its final moments, the creature had struck him down with one of its claws. He lay on the ground nearby, bleeding heavily but still breathing faintly. He looked up at me with weak eyes and whispered something I couldn't understand before closing them for good. I don't know how I made it out of that tunnel. My legs felt like they were moving on their own, carrying me through the darkness and back into the forest. By the time I reached Scout, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a pale light over the trees. I untied him with shaking hands and climbed into the saddle, my mind racing with everything that had just happened. Anthony was gone. The creature was dead, or at least I thought it was, but something didn't feel right. The air was still heavy with that sulfuric smell, and the forest was unnaturally quiet again. No birds, no wind, just silence. As I rode back toward the main trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something following me through the trees. But there was nothing, just shadows stretching long and dark in the early morning light. When I finally reached a small clearing near one of the park's hot springs, Scout stopped suddenly and refused to go any further. He snorted and stomped his hooves nervously, his ears pinned back as he stared at something ahead of us. I followed his gaze and saw it. The creature was standing there at the edge of the clearing, its body twisted and broken but somehow still alive. Its skin hung in tatters, revealing raw muscle and bone underneath, and its eyes burned with an unnatural light that made my stomach churn. It shouldn't have been able to move after what I'd done to it in the tunnel, but here it was, stronger than before, its form shifting and flickering like it couldn't decide what shape to take. I dismounted Scout and drew my revolver again, though I wasn't sure it would do much good. The obsidian blade was gone. I'd left it behind in the tunnel, and all I had now was my gun and my father's silver pocket watch in my coat pocket. The creature took a step toward me, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring this moment. "You can kill me," it said in a voice that sounded like Anthony Sepp's now. "You already lost." I didn't answer. My hands were shaking as I aimed the revolver at its chest and fired. The bullet hit its mark but didn't even slow it down. The creature just kept coming. Then I remembered what Anthony had told me before he died. It can only be killed when it reveals its true form. I realized then that this thing wasn't done playing with me yet. It was trying to break me down to make me afraid enough to give up before it showed me what it really was. But I wasn't going to let that happen. I backed up slowly toward the hot springs behind me, keeping my gun trained on the creature as it advanced. The water bubbled and steamed in the cool morning air, filling the clearing with a faint mist. "You want me?" I said through gritted teeth. "Come and get me." The creature stopped suddenly, tilting its head like it was confused by my words. Then its body began to shift again, its limbs lengthening and twisting as its skin peeled away completely. What stood before me now wasn't human or animal. It was something ancient and horrible beyond words. Its body glowed faintly with an unnatural light, and its many eyes stared at me with a hunger that made my blood run cold. This was its true form. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my father's silver pocket watch. The one thing I'd carried with me through everything, the war, my failed marriages, all of it. The watch had stopped years ago during a battle overseas, but now it felt heavy in my hand, like it still had some kind of purpose left to serve. The creature lunged at me with a deafening roar just as I threw myself backward into the hot spring behind me. The scalding water burned my skin as I sank beneath the surface, clutching the watch tightly in one hand while firing blindly at the creature with my other hand. For a moment, everything went still. The water muffled all sound around me except for the pounding of my own heartbeat in my ears. Then there was an explosion of light above me as the creature screamed one final time, a sound so loud it felt like it could split the earth in two, and then silence again. When I surfaced moments later, gasping for air, there was no sign of the creature anywhere. The clearing was empty except for Scout standing nervously at the edge of the trees. I climbed out of the water slowly, every muscle in my body aching from exhaustion. My father's pocket watch was still clutched tightly in my hand, and when I looked at it closely, I saw that it had stopped again at exactly midnight. By the time the search party found me, I was sitting on a fallen log near the hot springs, staring at my father's pocket watch. My clothes were soaked, my skin was burned in places from the scalding water, and I was covered in dirt and blood. Scout stood nearby, still uneasy, but refusing to leave my side. The rangers who arrived didn't know what to make of me. I must have looked half crazed as I tried to explain what had happened. The creature, the tunnel, Anthony Blackhawk's death. But when they searched the area, they didn't find anything. No footprints, no bones, no signs of a struggle. Even the symbols carved into the trees were gone. It was like the creature had never existed. I told them to check the mining tunnel, but when they went inside, they found nothing there either. No bones, no glowing chamber, no trace of Anthony. Just an empty tunnel that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. They took me back to headquarters and had me checked out by a doctor. Physically, I was fine, just a few cuts and bruises. But mentally, that was another story. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. Everything that had happened felt so real. But now there was no proof, no evidence to back up my story. The Park Service decided to transfer me to an administrative desk job after that. They didn't say it outright, but I knew they thought I'd cracked under the pressure of being out in the wilderness alone for too long. They dismissed my claims as stress-induced paranoia and told me to take some time off before starting my new position. I didn't argue with them. What could I say? Even I wasn't sure what was real anymore. But there was one thing that kept nagging at me. The pocket watch. It had stopped again at exactly midnight during my final confrontation with the creature. That couldn't have been a coincidence. For weeks after returning home, I couldn't stop thinking about it all. The creature's voice mimicking people I'd loved and lost. Anthony's warning about the skin taker, the way it seemed to know everything about me, even things no one else could have known. And then there were the whispers. Even now, sitting alone in my apartment far away from Yellowstone, I sometimes hear them late at night, soft voices calling my name from somewhere just beyond the edge of hearing. Malcolm. I try to ignore them, but they're always there, waiting in the darkness. One night, as I stood in front of the bathroom mirror brushing my teeth, something happened that made my heart stop cold. My reflection, it wasn't right. At first glance, it looked normal, just me staring back at myself. But then its expression changed. It smiled. Not a friendly smile, a slow, unnatural smile that stretched across its face while mine stayed frozen in shock. I dropped the toothbrush and stumbled backward out of the bathroom, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. When I finally worked up the courage to look again, my reflection was normal again, just me staring back with wide eyes and a pale face. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. My name is Vivian Rodriguez. I'm a senior ranger at Carlsbad Caverns National Park in New Mexico, the first woman to ever hold the position, and trust me, it hasn't been easy. People don't think I belong here, but I've spent my life studying caves. I know them better than I know myself. Still, every time I step into one, my heart races and my hands sweat. Claustrophobia doesn't go away, you just learn to live with it. It was a quiet morning when everything started. The sun was shining, tourists were snapping pictures, and I was leading a VIP group through the main sections of the caverns. You know the usual stuff, pointing out stalactites and stalagmites, explaining how they form over thousands of years. I've done this tour 100 times. But then, just as we were wrapping up, the ground shook. It wasn't a big earthquake, just enough to make everyone stop and look around nervously. Dust fell from the ceiling, and I heard someone gasp, "Is this normal?" One of the visitors asked. "Nothing to worry about," I said quickly, even though my stomach was doing flips. Earthquakes can open up new fissures in caves. It's rare, but it happens. And sure enough, when we checked the area later, there it was, a narrow crack in the rock wall that hadn't been there before. The park director called an emergency meeting that afternoon. He wanted to send someone in to check it out before announcing anything to the public. "We need to make sure it's safe," he said. "No surprises." I volunteered immediately. Some of my colleagues looked at me like I was crazy. They always do, but this is what I live for. Exploring the unknown, that's why I became a ranger. As we were leaving the meeting, someone mentioned that a couple of local teenagers had gone missing recently. "Probably nothing," they said, but the timing felt odd to me. That night, as I packed my gear for the descent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. But I told myself it was just nerves. After all, caves are unpredictable places, and so is life. I stood at the edge of the new fissure, my helmet light cutting through the darkness. The air felt colder than usual, and there was a faint smell like damp earth mixed with something metallic. My team was small but solid. Lewis, our photographer, who never stopped cracking jokes. Martinez, a geologist who could tell you the age of a rock just by looking at it. And Hoffman, a park security officer who didn't say much but always looked like he was ready for trouble. "Ready?" I asked, trying to sound confident. They nodded, and we began our descent. The crack led to a narrow tunnel that twisted and turned like a snake. It wasn't on any of our maps, which made it exciting, but also dangerous. We marked our path as we went, using chalk and reflective tape so we could find our way back. At first, everything seemed normal. The walls were covered in calcite formations that sparkled when our lights hit them. Lewis kept snapping pictures, saying things like, "This is gonna make the cover of National Geographic." His voice echoed strangely, bouncing off the walls in ways that didn't quite feel right. About an hour in, the temperature dropped sharply. "Is it just me, or is it freezing down here?" Martinez asked, rubbing his arms. "It's not just you," I said. "Caves have their own climate, but this was unusual." My breath was visible in the beam of my flashlight. Then the equipment started acting up. Our radios crackled with static, and Hoffman's compass spun wildly like it couldn't find north. "This isn't normal," he muttered. We pressed on anyway. What else could we do? But then Martinez slipped. One second he was walking ahead of me, the next he was gone. I heard him scream as he fell into a pit just off the path. "Martinez!" I shouted, scrambling to the edge. He was lying at the bottom, clutching his leg. "I think it's broken," he groaned. We set up a rope system to pull him out, but as we worked, he said something that made my blood run cold. Something brushed past me down there. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I don't know," he said, his voice shaky. It felt alive. I told myself it was just his imagination, maybe a bat or a draft of air, but deep down I wasn't so sure. We decided to set up camp nearby so Martinez could rest before we tried to get him back to the surface. As I lay in my sleeping bag that night, staring at the jagged ceiling above me, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone down there. I woke up to the sound of dripping water. For a moment, I forgot where I was, but then the cold, damp air brought me back. We were still deep underground, and Martinez was still injured. He looked pale, his forehead slick with sweat. "How are you feeling?" I asked. "Like I got hit by a truck," he muttered, forcing a weak smile. We decided to push forward a little further before heading back to the surface. Martinez insisted he could manage with some help, and we didn't want to leave without learning more about the fisher. But something about the cave felt different. That morning, the air was heavier, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been. As we moved deeper, we found something strange. Old equipment, rusted lanterns, ropes, even a canteen, scattered along the floor. "This stuff looks like it sips from the 1940s, Lewis said, picking up a corroded climbing hook. "But there sips no record of anyone exploring this section." "Maybe they didn't make it out," Hoffman said grimly. The walls around us began to change, too. Instead of smooth rock, they were covered in markings, lines, and shapes carved into the stone. At first, I thought they were natural patterns, but the more I looked, the more deliberate they seemed. Geometric shapes repeated over and over, like some kind of language. "Pictographs?" Martinez asked weakly from where he leaned against Hoffman for support. "Maybe," I said, running my fingers over one of the carvings, but they didn't look like any indigenous art I'd ever seen. They felt wrong somehow, like whoever made them wasn't trying to tell a story, they were trying to warn us. Then we found the chamber. It was massive, with a ceiling so high our lights couldn't reach it. The floor was littered with strange formations, columns of calcite that looked almost human. Some were small and hunched, others were tall and stretched unnaturally thin. "These formations are incredible," Lewis whispered as he snapped photos. But as we walked among them, I started to notice something unsettling. They weren't random, they were arranged in rows like statues in a gallery. That's when Martinez started mumbling under his breath. "They're watching us," he said. "What?" I asked, turning to him. "They're in my head," he whispered, clutching his temples. His eyes were wide with fear. Before I could respond, a faint movement caught my eye at the edge of my flashlight beam. Something pale darted between two columns, so fast I almost thought I imagined it. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "See what?" Hoffman said sharply, scanning the darkness with his light. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we need to get out of here." We turned back toward the tunnel we'd come through, but it wasn't there anymore. A fresh rockfall had sealed it off completely. My chest tightened as panic set in. We were trapped, and somewhere in the darkness, something was watching us. We stared at the wall of rock where the tunnel used to be. The collapse wasn't natural, that much was clear. The edges of the rubble were sharp, almost deliberate, like something or someone had done this on purpose. "We're trapped," Lewis said, his voice shaking. "Not yet," I replied, trying to sound calm even though my heart was pounding. "There's always another way in caves, we just need to find it." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The carvings on the walls, the strange formations, the pale figure I thought I saw, it all felt connected, and none of it felt right. We decided to set up camp again, hoping Martinez could rest while we figured out our next move. He'd gotten worse, his skin was clammy, and he kept mumbling things that didn't make sense. "They're here, they've always been here, they're waiting." His words sent chills down my spine. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was standing just outside the glow of our lanterns, watching us. The darkness felt alive, pressing in from all sides. I told myself it was just my imagination, but then Martinez screamed. I bolted upright, my flashlight in hand. His sleeping bag was empty. "Martinez," I shouted, my voice echoing through the cavern. We found his harness near one of the columns, the straps torn and covered in a slimy, viscous film that smelled faintly metallic. There was no sign of him anywhere else. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. "What the hell is going on?" Hoffman growled, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. Before I could answer, Lewis shined his light toward the far end of the chamber and froze. "Do you see that?" he whispered. At first, I didn't know what he was talking about, but then I saw them, dozens of tiny reflections in the darkness. Eyes, hundreds of them, staring back at us. "Turn off your lights," I whispered urgently. "What? Why?" Hoffman asked. "Just do it," I snapped. Reluctantly, we switched off our flashlights. The chamber plunged into complete darkness, but then we heard it, a soft clicking sound, like nails tapping against stone. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, growing louder with each passing second. And then came the voices. At first they sounded like whispers, faint and distant, but they grew louder until it felt like they were inside my head. They weren't speaking English, or any language I recognized, but somehow I understood them. "You shouldn't be here." I gripped my helmet tightly, trying to block out the sound. My breathing was shallow, my chest felt tight, and then I saw them just for a moment, as Lewis's camera flashed. The creatures were pale and thin, with skin so translucent you could see their veins beneath it. Their eyes were huge and black, reflecting the light like mirrors. They moved unnaturally fast, their limbs bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Lewis lowered his camera slowly, his face pale as a ghost. "They're everywhere," he whispered. "We had to get out. Now." We didn't sleep after that. How could we? Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. The creatures didn't attack us outright, but they didn't leave either. They stayed just beyond the edge of our lights, watching, waiting. By morning, if it even was morning, we decided to move. Staying in one place felt like asking for trouble. We packed up what little gear we had left and started searching for another way out. The deeper we went, the stranger the cave became. The walls were covered in more of those carvings, lines, and shapes that seemed to pulse when you stared at them too long. The air grew warmer, almost humid, and there was a faint glow coming from somewhere ahead. When we reached the source of the light, I stopped dead in my tracks. The chamber was enormous, bigger than anything I'd ever seen underground. The walls shimmered with a faint bioluminescent glow, coming from patches of fungus that clung to the rock. In the center of the room was something even stranger, structures made of stone and bone arranged in patterns that looked almost intentional, like buildings in a city. "This isn't natural," Lewis whispered, his voice trembling. "No," I agreed, swallowing hard. "It's not." As we moved closer, we saw more details, tools made from carved rock and bone, piles of strange objects that looked like they'd been collected over centuries. And then there were the remains. Human remains. They were everywhere, bones arranged in spirals and circles, some of them so old they crumbled to dust when touched. Others were disturbingly fresh. "What is this place?" Hoffman muttered, his voice barely audible. "I think it sets a hive," I said slowly. "A home." Lewis knelt by one of the piles of bones and picked up something small, a locket on a chain. He opened it and froze. "This belonged to one of the missing teenagers," he said quietly. Before I could respond, we heard a sound, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. It wasn't coming from any one direction, it was all around us. And then we saw him. At first, I thought it was another one of the creatures, but as he stepped into the light, I realized he was human, or at least, he used to be. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, and his eyes were milky white. He stumbled toward us, mumbling something under his breath. "Help me," he said weakly. I rushed forward to catch him as he collapsed into my arms. His body was cold and frail, like he hadn't eaten in weeks. "Who are you?" I asked urgently. "They keep us here," he whispered. "They feed on us." "Feed on you? How?" Hoffman asked sharply. "Not our bodies," the man said, his voice barely audible now. "Our minds, our fear, our memories." I felt a chill run down my spine as his words sank in. These creatures weren't just hunting us. They were farming us. The man's breathing grew shallow, and then he went still in my arms. He was gone. "We need to leave," Lewis said urgently, his voice shaking. But before we could move, the hum grew louder, and suddenly they were everywhere. Dozens of them poured into the chamber from every direction, their pale bodies moving with impossible speed. Their eyes glinted in the faint light as they surrounded us completely. And then they stopped. For a moment, everything was silent, except for the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then I felt it, a presence in my mind, pushing its way in like an unwelcome guest. Images flashed before my eyes, cities crumbling into dust, oceans swallowing land, stars winking out one by one, and then I saw them, humans descending into darkness over centuries until they became this. They were human. I whispered aloud without realizing it. They were just like us. And now they weren't set anymore. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground, and my mind was spinning with the images the creatures had forced into my head. Cities crumbling, darkness swallowing the world, and people turning into them. It wasn't just a story, it was their history. They were showing me who they were, what they had become. "They're not going to let us leave," Lewis whispered, his voice trembling. "They set hurting us." I said, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. They set pushing us deeper. Hoffman gripped his flashlight tightly, his knuckles white. "We're not just going to sit here and let them kill us," he growled. But killing us wasn't their plan. Not yet. They wanted something else. I could feel it in the way they stared at us, their huge black eyes unblinking. They wanted our fear, our thoughts, our memories. They wanted to pull us apart piece by piece until there was nothing left. Suddenly, Hoffman snapped. He pulled out his gun and fired into the darkness. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space, and the creatures scattered like shadows fleeing from light. "Stop," I shouted, grabbing his arm. "You'll bring the whole cave down." But it was too late. The ground beneath us trembled, and chunks of rock began to fall from the ceiling. One of the larger pieces crashed between us, separating me from Hoffman and Lewis completely. "Vivian," Lewis shouted from the other side of the rubble. I yelled back, coughing as dust filled the air. "Stay where you are," said, "I'll find another way around." I didn't know if they could hear me through the noise, But I didn't have time to wait for an answer. The creatures were closing in again, their movements faster and more aggressive now. I turned and ran blindly into the darkness, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I searched for an escape. The tunnel twisted and turned, narrowing until I had to crouch just to keep moving forward. My breathing was shallow, my chest tight with panic. But then I heard it, a sound like rushing water. I followed it until I reached another chamber, a smaller one this time, with an underground river cutting through its center. The water glowed faintly from the same bioluminescent fungus that clung to the walls, casting eerie shadows across the room. And that's when I saw Lewis. He was sitting by the edge of the river, his head tilted back as if he were staring at something above him, but his eyes were closed. "Lewis," I called out, rushing toward him. He turned slowly to face me, and my stomach dropped when I saw his face. His eyes were milky white, just like the man we'd found earlier. "I can see better now," he said softly. "What are you talking about?" I asked, kneeling beside him. "They showed me everything," he whispered. "It's Sep's beautiful." "No," I said firmly, grabbing his shoulders and shaking him. "This isn't Sept real. You have to fight it." But he just smiled. A calm, eerie smile that made my skin crawl and reached for my hand. His grip was cold and strong, and for a moment I felt something pull at my mind, like a thread being tugged loose. I jerked away from him and stumbled backward. "You're not Lewis anymore," I said quietly. He stood slowly, his movements unnatural now, jerky and disjointed, like a puppet on strings. "You don't have to fight it," he said, in a voice that wasn't set quite his own anymore. "You can join us." I backed away toward the river as he advanced on me, his pale skin glowing faintly in the dim light. There was no trace of the man I'd known anymore, just a hollow shell filled with something else entirely. And that's when I realized what I had to do. I didn't want to believe it, but Lewis was gone. Whatever those creatures had done to him, he wasn't himself anymore. His pale, empty eyes locked onto me as he stepped closer, his movements stiff and unnatural. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't save me. "Lewis, stop," I said, holding up my hands. "You don't have to do this." He tilted his head, like he was trying to understand me. It's not so bad," he said, in that strange, hollow voice. Behind him, I could hear the faint clicking sounds again. The creatures were coming. I didn't have much time. I glanced at the river. The current was strong, and the water looked deep. It wasn't a great option, but it was the only one I had. If I could get past Lewis and into the water, maybe I could find another way out. Sorry," I whispered. Before he could react, I lunged forward and shoved him as hard as I could. He stumbled backward and fell to the ground, giving me just enough time to dive into the river. The water was freezing and the current pulled me under almost immediately. I fought to keep my head above the surface, gasping for air as the river carried me deeper into the cave. The glow from the fungus lit the walls around me in a sickly green light, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to keep moving. The creatures wouldn't stop until they had me, and I wasn't about to let that happen. The river twisted and turned, narrowing until it felt like the walls were closing in on me. At one point, I had to duck underwater to squeeze through a tight passage. My lungs burned as I swam blindly forward, praying there was an opening on the other side. When I finally surfaced again, I found myself in another chamber, this one smaller and quieter than the others. The air was damp and heavy, and the only sound was the steady drip of water from the ceiling. I dragged myself onto a rocky ledge and collapsed, coughing up water and trying to catch my breath. My whole body ached, and my head was spinning from exhaustion and fear, but at least for now, I was alone. Or so I thought. A faint sound caught my attention, soft footsteps echoing through the chamber. My heart sank as I realized they'd found me again. I scrambled to my feet and grabbed a loose rock from the ground, holding it tightly in my trembling hands. If this was how it ended, I wasn't going down without a fight. But when the figure stepped into the light, it wasn't one of them. It was Hoffman. He looked just as battered as I felt, his uniform torn and covered in dirt, his face pale with fear, but he was alive. Relief washed over me as he stumbled toward me. "Vivian," he said hoarsely. "Thank God." "Hoffman," I breathed. "How did you—" "No time," he interrupted, shaking his head. "They sipped her everywhere. We have to move." I nodded and followed him as he led me toward another tunnel at the far end of the chamber. My legs felt like lead with every step, but adrenaline kept me going. We didn't speak. We couldn't afford to, but we both knew what we were up against now. The only question was whether we'd make it out alive. Hoffman and I moved quickly through the tunnel, our footsteps echoing against the damp walls. Every step felt like a gamble. One wrong turn and we could end up trapped again. The air was thick with tension, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the creatures were right behind us, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "Do you know where we're going?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's steps a passage ahead," Hoffman said, his eyes darting around nervously. "I think it leads back to the surface." "You think?" I pressed, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "It steps better than staying here," he replied. He was right. We didn't have any other options. The tunnel grew narrower as we went, forcing us to crouch and squeeze through tight spaces. My claustrophobia clawed at the edges of my mind, but I pushed it down. There wasn't time for fear, not now. Then we heard it. The clicking sound, the same one we'd heard before, echoed through the tunnel, growing louder with every passing second. It was coming from behind us, and it was getting closer. "They're here," Hoffman muttered, his grip tightening on his flashlight. "Keep moving," I urged him. We broke into a run, our breaths ragged and uneven as we stumbled over loose rocks and uneven ground. The clicking was deafening now, and I could feel the vibrations in my chest. They were right behind us. The tunnel opened up into another chamber, a smaller one this time, with a steep incline leading upward. At the top of the slope was a faint glimmer of light, the first sign of daylight we'd seen in days. "There," Hoffman shouted, pointing toward the opening. We scrambled up the incline as fast as we could, our hands and feet slipping on the wet rock. The creatures were right behind us now. I could hear their movements, quick and sharp, like claws scraping against stone. When we reached the top, I turned back just in time to see them emerge from the shadows. Their pale bodies seemed to glow in the dim light, their black eyes fixed on us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. They didn't make a sound. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to freeze me in place. "Go," Hoffman shouted, shoving me toward the opening. I stumbled forward into the light, blinking as my eyes adjusted to the brightness. The sunlight hit my skin like a wave of warmth, and for a moment I felt safe again. But then Hoffman screamed. I turned back just in time to see him dragged down by one of the creatures. He fought hard, kicking and swinging his flashlight like a club, but there were too many of them. They swarmed him like shadows swallowing light. "Hoffman," I screamed, reaching for him, but he shook his head. "Run," he shouted before disappearing into the darkness. I hesitated for only a moment before turning and running as fast as I could toward the surface. The tunnel grew brighter with every step until I finally burst out into the open air. The sun was rising over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath as tears streamed down my face. Hoffman was gone, and so was Lewis and Martinez and everyone else who had come with me into that cave. I looked back at the entrance to the cavern. It seemed so small now compared to everything that had happened inside it. But even as I stared at it, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching me from somewhere deep within. The park officials arrived shortly after sunrise. They found me sitting by the cave entrance, too shaken to speak at first. When I finally told them what had happened, they dismissed it as hallucinations caused by oxygen deprivation and stress. They sealed off the cave permanently later that day, citing structural concerns. But I knew better. Those creatures were still down there, and they weren't done yet. The days after my escape felt like a blur. I was taken to the hospital, treated for hypothermia and dehydration, and questioned endlessly by park officials and law enforcement. They wanted answers about what had happened to the others. about why I was the only one who made it out, but I couldn't give them the truth. Who would believe me? They didn't set naked, I said quietly when they pressed me. There was a cave-in. It all happened so fast. They nodded sympathetically, chalking it up to a tragic accident. No one asked too many questions after that. It was easier for everyone to accept the simple explanation. The cave entrance was sealed off within a week. Heavy equipment rolled in, and tons of concrete and rock were poured over the fissure to ensure no one could ever go back inside. The official report cited unstable conditions as the reason, but I knew the real reason: they didn't want anyone else disappearing. I tried to move on, but it wasn't easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces. Hoffman's determination, Lewis's eerie smile, Martinez's fear. And then there were the creatures, their pale skin, their black eyes, their silent movements that haunted my dreams. I quit my job at the park not long after. I couldn't bring myself to go back there, to walk those trails knowing what lay beneath them. Instead, I moved back in with my parents for a while, trying to rebuild some sense of normalcy for myself and my son. But even at home, I couldn't escape the feeling that something wasn't right. One evening, as I was helping my son with his homework, he pulled out a piece of paper and started drawing. At first, it seemed like nothing, just random lines and shapes, but then I froze. The symbols he was drawing were identical to the ones I'd seen carved into the walls of the cave. "Where did you see that?" I asked him, trying to keep my voice steady. He looked up at me with wide eyes and shrugged. "I don't know," he said simply. "They just came into my head." My blood ran cold as I stared at the paper. The symbols seemed to pulse on the page, just like they had in the cave. I didn't say anything else. I just took the paper and tucked it away in a drawer where he couldn't find it again. That night, as I lay awake in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that whatever was down there hadn't forgotten about me. And maybe it never would. My name is William Harrison, but most folks around here just call me Bill. I'm a ranger stationed in the Boundary Waters Canoe area, deep in the Superior National Forest of Minnesota. I've spent over 30 years in these woods, watching over the land, its creatures, and the people who come seeking adventure, or sometimes trouble. The winters here are brutal, but this one feels different. It's colder than I remember, harsher somehow. Maybe it's just me getting older, or maybe it's something else. I live alone now. My wife Sarah passed away 3 years ago. Cancer took her, and it took a piece of me with her. She loved this place as much as I do, maybe even more. She carved me a wooden loon whistle before she got sick. Said it was meant to bring me peace when I needed it most. I carry it everywhere, tucked in my jacket pocket like a little piece of her still with me. The first snow came early this year, thick flakes that blanketed the forest in silence. I spent the morning securing supplies at my remote ranger station. The blizzard warnings were serious, and once the storm hit, there'd be no way to get help or even contact headquarters. The old radio crackled as I tried to make one last call to check in, but all I got was static before the signal died completely. As I worked, something caught my eye outside the cabin window. The deer had disappeared from the area days ago, along with most of the rabbits and birds, but now there were tracks in the fresh snow. They weren't normal tracks. They were heart-shaped and too large for any animal I've ever seen. They circled the cabin like someone, or something, had been watching me. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside to take a closer look. The cold bit into my skin like tiny needles, but I ignored it as I followed the tracks around the cabin. They led into the woods and vanished under a cluster of pine trees. For a moment, everything was quiet, too quiet, and then I heard it, a low whisper carried on the wind. It wasn't words exactly, more like a feeling pulling at me. I shook it off and hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. Whatever was out there wasn't natural, and I wasn't about to find out what it wanted. The storm hit hard that night. Wind howled through the trees, shaking the cabin like it was made of paper. Snow piled up against the windows, and the temperature dropped so low I could see my breath inside. I added more wood to the fire and tried to keep busy, but my mind kept drifting back to those tracks outside. I couldn't explain them, and that whisper still lingered in my head. I was just about to turn in for the night when I heard a knock at the door. It startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone out here, especially during a storm like this. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door cautiously. Standing there were a young couple bundled up in coats that looked far too thin for this weather. "Please," the woman said, her voice shaking. "We're lost. Can we come in?" I hesitated for a moment, but they looked desperate and freezing. "Of course," I said, stepping aside to let them in. Their names were Thomas and Rebecca Miller, and they said they'd been hiking when the storm caught them off guard. They were both pale, but Thomas looked worse. His cheeks were hollow, and his eyes had a strange shine to them. Rebecca kept glancing at him like she was worried about something she wasn't saying out loud. I gave them some soup and blankets, and they warmed up by the fire. As we talked, I realized something odd. The route they claimed to have taken didn't make sense. The trails they mentioned were miles away from here and would have been impossible to hike in this weather. That night, as we tried to sleep, strange sounds started outside the cabin, scraping noises and heavy footsteps circling the walls. I sat up in bed, gripping my flashlight tightly. Thomas stirred in his sleep, mumbling something I couldn't make out, his voice sounding almost layered, like two people speaking at once. I stayed awake until morning, listening to those sounds and wondering what I'd gotten myself into. When morning came, the storm hadn't let up. Snow was piled so high against the cabin door that I had to shove it open just to step outside. The air was bitter cold, and the sky hung heavy with gray clouds. It felt like the kind of day where something bad was bound to happen. Inside, Thomas was eating like a man possessed. He devoured 3 bowls of oatmeal and still looked hungry, his eyes darting around the room like he was searching for more. Rebecca sat quietly by the fire, her hands trembling as she held her mug of tea. She hadn't eaten much, and her face was pale and drawn. "Are you sure you're okay?" I asked her, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded but didn't look at me. "We've just been out in the cold too long," she said softly. That didn't sit right with me. Something about them felt off, especially Thomas. His movements were jerky, almost unnatural, and his skin had taken on a grayish tint. I decided to check their backpack while they were distracted. It was sitting by the door, half open, so I quietly unzipped it and peeked inside. What I found made my stomach turn. The pack was full of survival rations, cans of food, protein bars, even bottled water, all untouched. If they'd been lost for 6 days like they claimed, why hadn't they eaten any of it? I zipped the bag back up and returned to the main room, trying to act normal. Rebecca caught me looking at Thomas and leaned closer to whisper something. "We weren't lost for 6 days," she said, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. "He wouldn't let me eat." I stared at her, stunned. Before I could ask what she meant, the radio crackled to life for just a moment, long enough for me to hear a voice calling out about 2 missing hikers matching their description. Then it went dead again. The pieces were starting to come together, but none of it made sense. Why would Thomas stop Rebecca from eating? And why did he seem so different? That night, I locked the cabin door tight and kept my flashlight within arm's reach. Whatever was going on with them wasn't normal, and I had a feeling things were about to get worse. That night, the storm seemed angrier than before. The wind slammed against the cabin, and the snow was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet outside the window. I tried to keep myself busy, but my nerves were shot. Something wasn't right with Thomas, and Rebecca knew it too. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound coming from the kitchen. It was wet and sloppy, like someone chewing raw meat. My heart started pounding as I grabbed my flashlight and crept toward the noise. Thomas was crouched by the freezer, his back to me. He'd ripped open a package of frozen steak and was eating it raw, blood dripping down his chin onto the floor. "Thomas," I shouted, my voice shaking. He turned to look at me, and for the first time I saw his eyes clearly. They weren't human anymore. They were dark, almost black, and filled with something hungry. His jaw looked longer than it should have been, and his skin had turned even grayer since that morning. Rebecca stumbled into the room behind me, gasping when she saw him. "It's happening," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" I asked her, but before she could answer, Thomas let out a low growl and lunged toward us. I grabbed Rebecca and pulled her into the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind us. We pushed the dresser against the door to block it, but Thomas didn't try to break in. Instead, we heard him pacing outside, muttering in a voice that sounded like two people speaking at once. One deep and guttural, the other high-pitched and frantic. Rebecca sat on the bed, clutching her knees to her chest. "He wasn't set always like this," she said quietly. "It started after we sheltered in an abandoned mine during the storm. He said he heard something calling him, and then he changed." I didn't know what to say. The more she talked, the less sense it made. But deep down, I knew she was telling the truth. Whatever had happened in that mine had turned Thomas into something else, something dangerous. As we sat there in silence, I noticed strange markings carved into the wooden floorboards under the bed, symbols I didn't recognize, but felt ancient somehow. It was like they'd been put there to keep something out, or maybe keep something in. The storm hadn't eased up by morning, but the cabin was eerily quiet. Thomas was nowhere to be seen. Rebecca sat by the fire, her face pale and her hands trembling. She didn't say much, but I could tell she was scared out of her mind. I didn't blame her. I was scared too. I was trying to figure out what to do next when I heard a knock at the door. My stomach dropped. I wasn't sure I could handle more surprises, but when I opened the door, I saw someone familiar. Joseph Kingbird, an elder from the local Ojibwe tribe. He was bundled in a heavy coat, his face lined with worry. "Bill," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "We need to talk." Joseph had always been a quiet man, but today he looked serious, like he knew something I didn't. He glanced at Rebecca, then back at me. "The Wendigo is awake," he said simply. I froze. The Wendigo was an old legend, a spirit born from greed and hunger that turned people into monsters. I'd heard stories about it from Joseph before, but I'd never believed them. Now, looking at Rebecca and remembering what Thomas had become, I wasn't so sure. Joseph explained that the Wendigo wasn't just a myth. It was real, and it was dangerous. He said it woke every 70 years during times of great hardship, feeding on people's desperation and hunger. The storm, the droughts, the recession, it had all created the perfect conditions for its return. "Thomas is no longer himself," Joseph said firmly. "The Wendigo has taken him." Rebecca started crying softly, and Joseph knelt beside her. "It's not your fault," he said gently. "But we have to stop him before he gets stronger." Joseph pulled out a pouch filled with herbs and powders, explaining that they were part of a ritual to weaken the Wendigo's hold on Thomas. He told me we'd need to track him down and perform the ritual before it was too late. I wanted to believe this was all just a bad dream, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Whatever Thomas had become wasn't human anymore, and if we didn't stop him soon, we might not survive. The night came quickly, swallowing the forest in darkness. The storm was still raging, but now the wind carried something else, a sound that made my skin crawl. It was a cry, long and haunting, like a mix of human and animal. Joseph stiffened when he heard it, his hand tightening around the pouch of herbs. "He sits close," Joseph said quietly. "The Wendigo is calling." Rebecca was sitting by the fire, wrapped in blankets, but she looked worse than before. Her cheeks were sunken, her lips cracked and pale. She hadn't said much since Joseph arrived, but now she spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's my fault," she said, staring into the flames. "I should stopped him when I had the chance." Joseph shook his head. "You couldn't have stopped him," he said firmly. "The Wendigo preys on weakness. It would found another way." Before I could respond, there was a loud crash outside the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle while Joseph prepared his herbs. Rebecca stayed inside, too weak to move. We stepped out into the storm, the cold biting through our coats like knives. Snow swirled around us, making it hard to see, but then we spotted him, Thomas, standing at the edge of the tree line. He wasn't human anymore. His arms and legs had stretched unnaturally long. His skin was gray and cracked like old bark, and his face, it wasn't his face anymore. It was twisted into something monstrous, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. "Thomas," I shouted, though I knew it was useless. He let out a guttural growl and lunged toward us faster than I thought possible. Joseph threw a handful of herbs into the air and began chanting in Ojibwe, his voice steady despite the chaos around us. Thomas stopped for a moment, seemingly confused by the smoke from the herbs, but then he turned his attention to Rebecca inside the cabin. Before we could stop him, he crashed through the window and attacked her. I ran inside just in time to see him bite into her shoulder before disappearing back into the storm. Rebecca was barely conscious, blood staining her blanket as Joseph worked quickly to stop the bleeding. Through her tears and pain, she whispered one last thing: "He brought me here because he needs you." The storm finally began to ease by morning, but the damage was done. Rebecca was alive, but barely. Her skin was pale as snow, and her breathing was shallow. Joseph had done all he could to stop the bleeding, but it was clear she didn't have much time left. "We can wait any longer," Joseph said, his voice grim. "If we don't stop him now, there will be nothing left of Thomas or us." I nodded, grabbing my rifle and some extra rounds. My hands were shaking, not just from the cold, but from something deeper: fear. I wasn't sure if it was fear of Thomas or fear of what I'd have to do to stop him. Joseph led the way into the forest, following tracks in the snow that were too large and too deep to belong to any man. The air felt heavier the farther we went, like the forest itself was holding its breath. As we walked, Joseph told me more about the wendigo. "It doesn't just kill," he said. "It consumes body and soul. Every victim makes it stronger." The thought made my stomach turn. I'd seen what Thomas had done to Rebecca, and I couldn't let it happen to anyone else. The tracks led us deeper into the woods, past frozen streams and jagged cliffs. We found signs of his passing: shredded animals, broken branches, and claw marks on trees that looked like they'd been made by something far bigger than a man. Then we found something worse: a pile of bones half buried in the snow. Some were animal, but others were human. Joseph knelt by the bones, murmuring a prayer under his breath. "These are the ones who came before us," he said quietly. "Rangers, hunters, people who disappeared over the years." I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. This thing had been here for decades, maybe longer, and no one had ever stopped it. We pressed on until we reached a clearing where the trees opened up to reveal a frozen lake. The ice was cracked and uneven, with strange patterns etched into its surface, circles and symbols that looked almost deliberate. Then I heard it again, that cry, part human and part animal, and felt my blood turn to ice. Thomas was here, watching us from somewhere in the shadows. Before I could react, he lunged out of nowhere, knocking Joseph to the ground. I raised my rifle, but my hands were trembling so badly I couldn't get a clear shot. "Go," Joseph shouted as Thomas clawed at him. "You have to finish this." I hesitated for only a moment before running toward the lake, clutching Joseph's pouch of herbs like it was my lifeline. The frozen lake stretched out before me, its surface cracked and uneven like a giant spiderweb. The storm had calmed, but the air was still bitter cold, and the silence was deafening. I could feel Thomas, or whatever he'd become, watching me from the shadows. My heart was pounding, but I kept moving toward the center of the lake, clutching Joseph's pouch of herbs tightly. I stopped when I reached a strange formation in the ice, a jagged hole surrounded by symbols etched into the surface. It looked ancient, like it had been there for centuries. The air around it felt colder than anywhere else, and I knew this was where it would end. Then I heard his voice, Thomas Sip's voice, but it wasn't really him anymore. It was layered, distorted, like two voices speaking at once. "Bill," it whispered, dragging out my name. "Why fight it? You sipped are already mine." I turned to see him standing at the edge of the lake, his body fully transformed. He was impossibly tall now, his limbs stretched thin like tree branches, and his face was nothing but a twisted deer skull with glowing eyes. He moved slowly toward me, each step cracking the ice beneath him. "Thomas," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You don't have to do this." He tilted his head in that unnatural way, and then he laughed, a sound that made my stomach churn. "This isn't about me," he said. "Except's about you?" I froze as his words sank in. Joseph had said the wendigo needed me specifically, but I hadn't understood why until now. It wasn't just feeding on Thomas's hunger, it was feeding on mine. My grief for Sarah, my fear of losing control to Parkinson's disease, it had been pulling me toward this moment all along. Thomas lunged at me, faster than I could react. He knocked me to the ground, his claws tearing into my coat as I struggled to push him off. The pouch of herbs spilled onto the ice, and I grabbed a handful, throwing them into his face. He recoiled for a moment, but it wasn't enough. I scrambled to my feet and pulled out the wooden loon whistle Sarah had carved for me. It felt warm in my hand despite the cold, and I blew into it as hard as I could. The sound echoed across the lake, clear and haunting like her voice calling out to me. Thomas froze, his glowing eyes flickering for just a moment before he let out an ear-piercing scream. The ice beneath us began to crack violently as if something deep below was waking up. I reached into my emergency bag and pulled out a stick of dynamite, the last resort for clearing blocked trails, and lit the fuse with trembling hands. "Come and get me," I said, backing toward the center of the lake. Thomas lunged again, just as the dynamite exploded, shattering the ice beneath us. We plunged into freezing water together, his scream fading as we sank deeper into the darkness. The dawn broke quietly over the frozen lake. The storm finally gone. The ice was shattered in the center, leaving a jagged hole filled with dark, freezing water. The snow had stopped falling, and the forest stood still, as if holding its breath. The search team arrived later that morning, called in by Joseph, after he managed to limp back to the ranger station. They found the lake, the broken ice, and scattered signs of the struggle, but no bodies. Thomas was gone, and so was I. Rebecca survived, though barely. She was taken to the hospital but never fully recovered. She told the search team everything about Thomas, about the wendigo, about what happened at the cabin, but they didn't believe her. They said she was delirious from blood loss and frostbite. Eventually, she stopped talking about it altogether and was moved to a psychiatric facility for treatment. Joseph stayed behind to protect the land. He carved new warning markers into trees around the territory and performed rituals to keep the wendigo from returning. He told Rebecca and anyone who would listen that my sacrifice had banished it for now, but that it would come back someday when hunger and greed took root again. Weeks later, my journal was found in the ranger station, tucked neatly under my bed. It contained detailed notes about the wendigo legend, its cycles of awakening, and everything I had witnessed over those 4 days. The authorities dismissed it as fiction, a ranger's attempt to make sense of a tragic accident, but Joseph knew better. The station was closed for the rest of the winter season, and a new ranger was assigned there the following year. On his first night in the cabin, he found something strange, a single heart-shaped footprint etched into the floorboards beneath his bed. My name is Diana Matthews. I'm a senior ranger in the Boundary Waters Canoe area of Minnesota, the first woman to hold the position in this district. It hasn't been easy. Most of my colleagues think I don't belong here. But I've fought harder battles before, like the one against my own fears when I nearly drowned as a kid. That fear drove me to become an Olympic swimmer, and eventually, someone who studies lakes for a living. Today started like any other day. The sun was shining. The air smelled like pine and fresh water, and Shadow Lake was calm, almost too calm. I was out on my canoe taking water samples for routine testing. The lake has always fascinated me. It's deep, dark, and surrounded by legends, whispered by locals. But I've never been one to believe in ghost stories. Science is my guide. As I dipped my equipment into the water, something felt off. The temperature readings didn't make sense. Parts of the lake were unusually warm for this time of year. The chemical composition seemed slightly altered too, though I couldn't say why just yet. I noticed fish darting around in strange patterns beneath the surface, almost like they were trying to escape something. It sent a chill down my spine, but I brushed it off as a natural phenomenon, maybe a predator lurking below. When I paddled back to shore, I met Dr. Harrison Wells, a geologist who had been sent to investigate seismic activity near the lake. He was friendly enough but seemed distracted as he stared at his maps and equipment. "You're seeing anomalies too?" he asked when I mentioned the strange water readings. Before I could answer, Michael Redwing, an indigenous guide who often worked with us, approached but stopped several feet from the lake sep's edge. "I won't go near that water," he said firmly. "Not today." "Why not?" I asked, confused by his sudden change in behavior. "There are old stories about this place," he said quietly, eyes fixed on the lake. "Stories about something that sleeps beneath it." I wanted to laugh it off, but his tone made me pause. There was something unsettling about the way he spoke, as if he truly believed what he was saying. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over Shadow Lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from beneath its surface. That night, I was back at the ranger station, finishing up my notes from the day. The strange readings from Shadow Lake were still nagging at me, but I told myself it was probably nothing. Lakes can be unpredictable, after all. Just as I was about to call it a night, a loud banging came from the door. When I opened it, 2 locals were carrying a fisherman between them. He looked terrible. His skin was pale, and there were strange burns on his arms and neck. "He was out on Shadow Lake," one of the men said quickly. "We found him like this, raving about something in the water." The fisherman Sip's eyes locked onto mine, wild and unfocused. "It's Sep's alive," he whispered hoarsely. "It's Sep's watching us." I tried to calm him down, but he kept muttering the same thing over and over. Eventually, we had to call for a medic to take him to the nearest hospital. After they left, I sat alone in the quiet station, staring at my compass, the one my grandfather had given me before he passed away. It was an antique brass compass that always worked perfectly, until tonight. No matter how I turned it, the needle pointed toward Shadow Lake. I shook it, tapped it against the desk, but it wouldn't budge. It made no sense. Compasses don't just stop working like that unless there's something interfering with them. Feeling uneasy, I decided to dig through some old records we kept in the station's archives. That's when I found a dusty journal from 1932 written by a ranger who worked here decades ago. His entries mentioned strange occurrences at Shadow Lake, unexplained disappearances, odd lights over the water at night, and even rumors of something large moving beneath the surface. One line stood out to me: "The lake hides more than its depths." As I read those words, a strange heaviness settled over me, like the air itself had grown thicker. That night, when I finally fell asleep in my small cabin near the station, I had the most vivid dream of my life. I was underwater, not in Shadow Lake, but somewhere ancient and endless. The water glowed faintly with a greenish light, and strange creatures swam around me, things I'd never seen before in any textbook or research paper. They looked like they belonged to another time, another world. When I woke up gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest, I realized something else. My compass was still on my nightstand, and it was still pointing toward Shadow Lake. The next morning, I couldn't shake the dream or the strange events from the night before. Something wasn't right about Shadow Lake, and I was determined to figure out what was happening. Dr. Wells joined me as I prepared my canoe for another trip out on the water. He had brought some equipment to take core samples from the lake bed, hoping to find clues about the seismic activity in the area. As we paddled toward the center of the lake, the air felt heavier, almost like a storm was coming, even though the sky was clear. The water was eerily still, and I couldn't hear any birds or insects nearby. It was so quiet that every sound, the paddle hitting the water or breathing, felt amplified. When Wells lowered his sampling device into the lake, he frowned at the readings. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "There's SUP's organic material down there, but it's SEP's not like anything I've seen before." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning closer to his monitor. "It's SEP's alive," he said hesitantly. "But it's SEP's not plant life or fish, it's SEP's something else." Before we could discuss it further, we spotted something unusual near the shore, a pile of abandoned equipment half buried in mud. When we went to investigate, we realized it was old military gear, rusted diving suits, broken sonar devices, and a box marked Operation Deep Channel. "What is this?" I asked aloud, brushing dirt off one of the boxes. Wells looked uneasy. I heard rumors about military projects in this area during the Cold War, he said. They were testing underwater weapons or something like that. As we examined the equipment, a strange sound echoed across the lake, a low, rumbling noise that seemed to come from deep underwater. It wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It sounded almost alive, like a heartbeat or a growl. We tried to radio back to headquarters for backup, but all we got was static mixed with faint noises that sounded like whale songs. Wells adjusted the frequency several times, but nothing worked. Later that afternoon, we found something even more unsettling. Ancient cave paintings near a rocky part of the shore. They showed figures kneeling before a massive serpent-like creature in the water, a creature with glowing eyes and multiple limbs. Do you think this is just mythology? Wells asked nervously as he traced one of the drawings with his finger. I don't know, I admitted, feeling a chill run down my spine. But whatever step's happening here, it's been happening for a long time. As I reached out to touch one of the cave walls, my vision blurred for a moment and everything went black. When I came to, Wells was shaking my shoulder, looking panicked. You just collapsed, he said urgently. Are you okay? I nodded weakly but didn't tell him what I had seen during those few seconds of darkness, a vision of Shadow Lake from above, glowing faintly as something huge moved beneath its surface. That night, the tension in the air was almost unbearable. The strange sounds we'd heard on the lake earlier still echoed in my mind, and the cave paintings haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about what Michael Redwing had said, the stories about something sleeping beneath the water. As darkness fell, a search party arrived at the ranger station. 2 teenagers had gone missing earlier in the day. They were last seen canoeing on Shadow Lake, but no one had heard from them since. The parents were frantic, and I knew we had to act fast. Michael Redwing joined us reluctantly, though he refused to go near the water. Before we left, he pulled me aside. You need to understand, he said quietly. This isn't just a story or a legend. My grandfather told me about the thousand-mouthed one beneath. It calls to people, draws them in. I wanted to tell him that it sounded ridiculous, but something in his eyes stopped me. He truly believed what he was saying, and after everything I'd seen and heard, I wasn't so sure he was wrong. Out on the lake, we searched for hours with flashlights and spotlights, but there was no sign of the teenagers. Then, just as we were about to give up for the night, someone spotted their canoe floating near the center of the lake. When we reached it, my stomach dropped. The canoe was empty, except for a strange slimy residue coating the seats and edges. It smelled metallic and faintly rotten, like something that had been pulled from deep underwater. As we towed the canoe back to shore, I noticed something glowing faintly beneath the surface of the water, a soft blue-green light that pulsed rhythmically, like a heartbeat. Do you see that? I whispered to Wells, who was paddling beside me. He nodded slowly, his face pale in the moonlight. It's alive, he said in a voice barely above a whisper. Back at the station, things only got stranger. Wells started acting oddly. He was scribbling incomprehensible diagrams on scraps of paper and muttering to himself about patterns and connections. When I tried to talk to him, he barely seemed to hear me, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Meanwhile, Redwing shared more of his tribe's stories with me while keeping his distance from the lake. It doesn't just take people, he said grimly. It changes them. I didn't understand what he meant until later that night when I woke up from another vivid dream, this time of myself walking into Shadow Lake willingly, my body sinking deeper and deeper into its cold embrace while something massive waited for me below. When I sat up in bed, drenched in sweat, I realized something horrifying. My feet were wet. The next morning, I couldn't stop staring at my damp footprints on the cabin floor. I didn't remember leaving my bed, but somehow, I had been outside. My boots were still by the door, untouched, which meant I had walked out barefoot. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I pulled myself together and joined the search team again. The missing teenagers still hadn't been found, and everyone was growing more desperate. As we combed the shoreline, we came across their canoe again, this time further down the lake. But what we found inside made my stomach turn. There were claw marks gouged into the wood, as if someone or something had tried to climb in or out. The same slimy residue coated the edges, and this time there were strands of something that looked like translucent hair or tentacles tangled in the seats. One of the search team members muttered, "What kind of animal does this?" But no one had an answer. By midday, things took an even darker turn. Wells insisted on diving near the center of the lake to collect more samples. I argued against it. Something about the water felt wrong, but he wouldn't listen. He suited up and went under while we waited anxiously on the boat. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. When his equipment finally surfaced, it was empty. No Wells, just his oxygen tank and a few torn straps from his harness. Panic set in as we called his name over and over, but there was no response. The water around us started to ripple, even though there was no wind. It was subtle at first, but then it grew stronger, like something massive was moving beneath us. That's when we saw them, small eel-like creatures writhing on the shore nearby. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Pale and slimy with glowing blue-green veins running through their bodies. They shouldn't have been alive. They were completely out of water, but they twitched and squirmed as if they were trying to get back to the lake. One of the team members reached out to touch one, but I stopped him just in time. "Don Set," I said sharply. "We Don Set know what they are." As we backed away from the creatures, Redwing arrived with a grim expression on his face. He pointed at the writhing eels and said softly, "They sipper part of it." "Part of what?" I asked, my voice shaking despite myself. "The thing beneath," he replied simply. "Its steps waking up." The rest of the day was a blur of fear and confusion. The lake's water level had started rising inexplicably despite the ongoing drought, swallowing parts of the shoreline that had been dry just days before. And everywhere I went, I felt that same pull, the strange compulsion to walk into the water that I'd felt in my dream. By nightfall, 2 members of our search team had gone missing without a trace. That night, I couldn't sleep. The events of the day had left me shaken. Wells was gone. 2 search team members had vanished, and the lake seemed to be swallowing everything around it. I sat at my desk in the ranger station, staring out the window at the dark water in the distance. I didn't want to admit it, but I could feel it. Something was pulling at me, not just physically, but mentally. It was like a voice whispering in the back of my mind, calling me closer to the lake. I tried to distract myself by going over the water samples we'd collected earlier. That's when I noticed something strange under the microscope. Tiny microorganisms swimming in the sample, glowing faintly with that same blue-green light I'd seen in the lake. They weren't like any algae or bacteria I'd studied before. As I watched them move, my head started to ache, and my vision blurred slightly. It felt like they were communicating with me somehow, though I couldn't explain how or why. Suddenly, I heard a noise outside, a soft splash, followed by footsteps. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out into the cold night air and followed the sound to the shoreline. What I saw made my heart stop. 2 of the missing search team members were standing ankle-deep in the lake, their backs to me. Their clothes were soaked, and their heads hung low as if they were asleep on their feet. "Hey," I called out, running toward them. "What are you doing?" They didn't respond. Instead, they took slow, deliberate steps deeper into the water. "Stop," I shouted, grabbing one of them by the arm. His skin was ice cold and slick with that same slimy residue we'd found on the canoe. When he turned to look at me, his eyes were blank, completely white, like he wasn't even human anymore. Before I could pull him back, he wrenched free from my grip and disappeared beneath the surface along with his companion. The water rippled once and then went still again as if nothing had happened. Shaking, I stumbled back to the station and locked the door behind me. My hands wouldn't stop trembling as I tried to process what I'd just seen. That's when Redwing knocked on the door and came inside without waiting for an invitation. He looked grim but calm, like he'd been expecting this all along. "They've spur gone," he said simply. "The lake has them now." "What is happening?" I asked desperately. "What is this thing?" He hesitated before answering, his voice low and steady. "It steps not just a creature," he said finally. "It steps something older than we can imagine, something that doesn't step belong here." I wanted to argue or tell him he was wrong, but deep down, I knew he wasn't. Whatever was in that lake wasn't just an animal or a natural phenomenon, it was something far beyond our understanding. That night, when I finally fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion, I dreamed again, not of myself this time, but of it. In my dream, I saw its massive body coiled beneath the lake bed like a sleeping giant. Its glowing eyes stared directly at me as if it knew who I was and what I feared most. When I woke up gasping for air, there was one thought echoing in my mind: it knows me now. By the time the sun rose, I knew I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. Shadow Lake wasn't just dangerous, it was alive and it was waking up. Whatever was beneath the surface wasn't just pulling people in, it was changing them, making them part of itself. I spent the morning going through every piece of research I could find about the lake, its history, and the strange military equipment we discovered. That SEPs when I remembered the box labeled Operation Deep Channel. Inside were old documents and maps detailing experiments conducted decades ago. They weren't just testing underwater weapons, they were studying something they'd found deep in the lake bed. The files mentioned a biological anomaly that emitted electromagnetic pulses strong enough to disrupt radio signals and even human brain activity. One line stood out to me: subject exhibits vulnerability to copper-based compounds. It wasn't much, but it was something, a weakness. If this creature could be affected by copper, maybe there was a way to stop it before it took more lives. I reached out to an old contact, a retired military scientist named Dr. Alan Greaves, who had worked on similar projects years ago. When I described what was happening at Shadow Lake, he didn't sound surprised. "You're dealing with something that shouldn't exist," he said bluntly. "If it sets anything like what we studied back then, you need to act fast. Copper sulfate might work, but you still need a lot of it." I explained my plan to Redwing later that afternoon. He listened carefully but shook his head when I finished. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "This thing isn't just physical. It's spiritual too. It's connected to everything in the lake, maybe even beyond it." "What are you saying?" I asked, frustrated. "I'm saying you can fight it with science alone," he replied firmly. "We need to block its influence first." Redwing performed a ritual near the shore that evening, chanting softly as he burned herbs and scattered ashes into the water. He didn't explain what he was doing, but as the smoke rose into the air, I felt a strange sense of clarity, like a fog had lifted from my mind. With his help, I began preparing copper sulfate to poison the lake. It felt wrong, like I was betraying everything I stood for as a scientist and protector of nature, but there was no other choice. If we didn't stop this thing now, more people would die, or worse. As I analyzed more water samples, I discovered something horrifying. Tiny parasitic microorganisms from the lake were already affecting human brain chemistry. They weren't just pulling people into the water, they were rewiring their minds, making them part of whatever lived beneath. The thought made my skin crawl, but it also strengthened my resolve. This wasn't just about saving lives. It was about stopping something that could spread far beyond Shadow Lake if we didn't act now. By nightfall, everything was ready for the final confrontation. That night, I knew there was no turning back. The copper sulfate was ready, but to use it effectively, I needed to get closer to the creature. Redwing had warned me that the lake's pull would grow stronger the deeper I went, but I couldn't let fear stop me. Wearing my diving gear, I joined the small team heading out onto Shadow Lake. The water was eerily calm, reflecting the moonlight like a mirror. As we paddled toward the center of the lake, I felt that familiar tug in my mind, a quiet voice urging me to let go, to sink into the depths. We reached the spot where Wells had disappeared, and I steeled myself as I prepared to dive. Redwing stayed behind on the boat, chanting softly under his breath. "Stay strong," he said, as I slipped into the cold water. The descent was slow and disorienting. My flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, and strange shapes seemed to move in the shadows around me. The water grew colder and heavier with each meter, pressing against me like an invisible force. Then I saw it, the entrance to an underwater cave system that stretched deep into the lake bed. The walls were covered in glowing blue-green veins, pulsing faintly like they were alive. As I swam through the narrow passage, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like I was trespassing somewhere I didn't belong. Inside the main cavern, I finally saw the creature. It was massive, its eel-like body coiled around itself in layers, its glowing organs casting eerie light across the chamber. Its limbs floated lazily in the water, each one tipped with sharp, claw-like appendages. And then there was Wells, or what was left of him. He stood near the creature's head, his eyes glowing faintly as he stared at me. His movements were slow and unnatural, like he wasn't fully human anymore. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a voice that sounded hollow and distant. "What happened to you?" I asked, my voice trembling despite myself. He didn't answer directly, but gestured toward the creature. "It's not what you think," he said cryptically. "It's not evil. It's just surviving." Before I could respond, a wave of images flooded my mind. Visions of primordial oceans teeming with life unlike anything on Earth. The creature wasn't from here. It had come from somewhere far beyond our understanding, trapped in this lake for millennia by forces we couldn't comprehend. The psychic assault left me gasping for air, but Wells stepped between me and the creature as if shielding it from harm. "You don't have to do this," he said softly, but I knew there was no other choice. As Wells moved closer to me, his body twitching unnaturally, I realized he wasn't going to let me leave alive. I threw the copper sulfate canisters toward the creature and turned to swim away as fast as I could. Behind me, Wells screamed, a sound that echoed through my mind more than my ears, and then everything went silent. The cavern began collapsing around me as the creature thrashed violently in its death throes. I barely made it back to the surface before my oxygen ran out. When I surfaced, gasping for air, the lake was no longer calm. The water churned violently, waves crashing against the shoreline as the creature thrashed below. Its glowing limbs broke through the surface, reaching toward the sky like twisted tree branches. The copper sulfate was working, but it wasn't enough. The creature was too massive, too powerful. It wasn't dying, it was fighting back. Redwing pulled me into the boat, his face pale with fear. "It's angry," he said simply, his voice trembling. "You heard it, but it won't stop until it takes everything." We paddled toward shore as fast as we could, but the water seemed to work against us, pulling us back toward the center of the lake. The creature's appendages stretched farther and farther, clawing at the land and dragging chunks of earth into the water. When we reached the shore, I saw military vehicles arriving, men in uniforms carrying heavy equipment and weapons. They weren't here to kill the creature, they were here to capture it. "You need to stop," I shouted at them as I ran toward their commander. "You don't understand what you start dealing with." But they ignored me, setting up sonar devices and explosives designed to trap the creature rather than destroy it. The ground trembled beneath my feet as the creature's thrashing grew more violent. The lake's water level was rising rapidly, flooding parts of the forest and swallowing everything in its path. I knew there was only one way to stop this. The dam upstream controlled the flow of water into Shadow Lake. If I destroyed it, I could drain the lake completely and expose the creature to air. It wouldn't survive outside its aquatic environment for long. Redwing tried to stop me as I grabbed a truck and drove toward the dam. "If you do this," he warned, "you still destroy everything. The ecosystem, the wildlife, everything." "I don't have a choice," I said firmly. "It's either this or losing everyone." When I reached the dam, I rigged explosives from the military gear I'd stolen during their chaos at the lake. My hands shook as I set the timer. I knew what I was about to do would change this place forever. As I drove away from the dam, it exploded behind me in a deafening roar. Water rushed out in a massive wave, draining Shadow Lake faster than I could have imagined. Back at the lake bed, the creature writhed helplessly in the mud, its glowing organs dimming as it struggled to breathe. Its appendages flailed weakly before collapsing one by one. The military moved in quickly, covering its body with tarps and loading pieces of it onto trucks. They didn't say a word to me or Redwing as they worked. They just packed up their equipment and left. The lake was gone. Nothing but a muddy crater remained where its dark waters had once been. The next morning, the landscape around Shadow Lake was unrecognizable. What had once been a pristine, untouched wilderness was now a muddy wasteland. The water was gone, the wildlife displaced, and the air felt heavy with loss. I stood at the edge of what used to be the shoreline, staring out at the empty crater. The creature's massive body was gone, hauled away by the military in the dead of night. They didn't leave any evidence behind, not even a footprint. It was as if they wanted to erase everything that had happened here. Redwing stood beside me, silent for a long time before finally speaking. "You did what you had to do," he said quietly. "But this place will never be the same." He was right. The lake was gone, and with it, an entire ecosystem that had existed for thousands of years. I knew I'd face consequences for what I'd done. An inquiry, maybe even dismissal from my position. But none of that mattered now. I'd made my choice, and I had to live with it. As the day went on, more military trucks arrived to quarantine the area. They put up fences and signs warning people to stay away, claiming it was a hazardous zone due to contaminated water. But I knew the truth. They didn't want anyone asking questions about what had really happened here. Before I left, I walked down to the muddy lake bed one last time. That's when I noticed something small glinting in the sunlight, a tiny puddle of water that hadn't dried up yet. I knelt down to examine it and froze. Inside the puddle were tiny glowing microorganisms, just like the ones I'd seen under my microscope. They swirled and pulsed faintly, almost as if they were alive, almost as if they were watching me. A chill ran down my spine as I realized what it meant. The creature wasn't entirely gone. It had left something behind, something small but alive. I stood up quickly and backed away from the puddle, my heart racing. As I turned to leave, I glanced toward the horizon and saw something that stopped me in my tracks. A new body of water forming miles away in a low-lying valley. It was small now, just a trickle of water pooling together, but it had that same eerie stillness as Shadow Lake. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was clear: this wasn't over. My name is Marcus Powell. I'm a park ranger at Redwood National Park in California. It's not just a job for me, it's my way of starting over. You see, I wasn't always a ranger. I used to be an anthropologist, studying the tribes of the Pacific Northwest, but that life fell apart after a scandal ruined my career, and then came the divorce. So here I am, trying to rebuild my life among the towering redwoods, where the air smells like earth and the trees feel like they're watching over you. I'm not just any ranger. My heritage gives me a unique connection to this place. My father was African American, and my mother was Yurok, a Native American tribe that has lived here for generations. She taught me about the land, the plants, and the stories passed down through our people. Those stories have always stayed with me, even when I tried to leave them behind. But life out here isn't easy. My arthritis has been getting worse lately, making it harder to hike through the forest like I used to. That's why I carry this walking stick. A hand-carved redwood staff with tribal symbols etched into it. It's more than just a tool. It's a reminder of who I am and where I come from. The park has been strange lately. The fog hasn't lifted for weeks, clinging to the coastline and creeping into the forest like it's alive. It's thicker than usual, and it moves in ways that don't make sense against the wind, swirling in patterns that seem deliberate. Some of the other rangers joke about it, calling it ghost weather, but I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong. This morning started like any other. I was patrolling a newly established trail through one of the ancient groves, the kind of place where the trees are so big you can't wrap your arms around them. The fog was there again, hanging low and heavy, muffling every sound except for my footsteps crunching on fallen leaves. I stopped when I saw them survey markers planted in the ground near some of the oldest trees in the grove. Bright orange flags fluttering in defiance of everything this park stands for. These markers meant one thing. The highway project was moving forward, despite all the protests from environmental groups and local tribes. As I stood there staring at those flags, I heard a rustle behind me. Turning around, I saw Victoria Thompson, a Yurok elder who often comes to collect traditional medicines from the forest. She's one of those people who carries wisdom in her eyes and speaks in riddles that make you think long after she's gone. "Marcus," she said softly, her voice barely louder than a whisper, "you shouldn't set me here." I frowned at her words. Why? What's wrong? She looked past me toward the fog creeping between the trees. The one who walks between worlds is waking up. I didn't know what she meant at first, but her tone sent a chill down my spine. She told me stories about this guardian spirit years ago, of being tied to these ancient trees, protecting them from harm, but those were just legends, weren't they? Before I could ask her more, she turned and walked away into the mist, disappearing as if she'd never been there at all. That night, back at my cabin, I couldn't stop thinking about what she said or about those survey markers in the grove. As I sat by the fire trying to warm my aching joints, something strange happened. The fog seeped into my cabin through cracks in the windows and doors, not just regular fog, but thick tendrils that seemed alive somehow. I swear it was watching me. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The fog hadn't left my cabin all night, and even now, as I stepped outside, it clung to the ground like a living thing. It wasn't normal, not here, not anywhere. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. I decided to report the survey markers to the park superintendent. His name is Bill Carter, a no-nonsense guy who's more concerned with keeping his bosses happy than protecting the park. When I told him about the markers being in a protected zone, he barely looked up from his paperwork. "Marcus," he said with a sigh, "those markers are temporary. The highway SIP's been approved by the state. They're SIPs, nothing we can do." I stared at him, trying to keep my frustration in check. "Bill, those trees are sacred to the Yurok people. They sit are some of the oldest in the park. We can just let them bulldoze through." He waved me off like I was wasting his time. "Look, if you SIP got a problem with it, take it up with the state. My hands are tied." I left his office feeling defeated, but as I walked back toward my truck, I saw Victoria Thompson standing near the edge of the parking lot. She was waiting for me. "They don't listen," she said quietly, as if she already knew what had happened. "No," I replied, shaking my head. "They don't care." She stepped closer, her eyes serious and full of something I couldn't quite place. Fear, sadness, maybe both. "Marcus," she said softly, "the one who walks between worlds doesn't care about permits or approvals. If they disturb the grove, it will wake." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. "Victoria," I said carefully, "what are you talking about? What is this thing?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she handed me a small leather-bound journal, old and worn, with pages yellowed by time. "This belonged to my grandfather," she explained. "He worked with a logging crew near here in 1919. Read it." I opened the journal and flipped through the pages. Most of it was ordinary notes about trees they'd cut and weather conditions. But then I found something strange. Entries about fog that wouldn't leave, and workers who went missing without a trace. One entry stood out. "The fog moves like it SIP's alive. We hear whispers at night, voices calling from deep in the woods. Something SIP's out there." I looked up at Victoria, my heart pounding in my chest. "You think this guardian spirit is real?" She nodded solemnly. "It sits as real as these trees." That night back at my cabin, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd read or about Victoria's warning. As I sat by the fire trying to make sense of it all, the fog returned again, thicker than before. It pressed against the windows like it wanted to come inside. And then, it did. The fog didn't just creep into my cabin that night. It felt like it was alive. It swirled around the room, clinging to the walls and furniture, moving in ways fog shouldn't move. I sat frozen in my chair, gripping my walking stick so tightly my knuckles turned white. It wasn't just the fog itself that scared me. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. And then, just as suddenly as it had arrived, it vanished. The air cleared, leaving behind an eerie silence. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, the park radio crackled with news that sent a chill down my spine. One of the construction workers from the highway survey team had gone missing. His name was Jake, young guy, always cracking jokes during lunch breaks. He'd been working near the grove where I'd found the markers. I joined the search team immediately. We combed through the forest all day, calling his name and scanning every inch of ground for clues. But the fog made everything harder. It was thicker than ever, swallowing sound and light, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. As we moved deeper into the grove, I started noticing something strange. Patches of glowing fungus growing in perfect circles around some of the oldest trees. It wasn't like anything I'd seen before. Bright green and faintly pulsing, almost like it was breathing. Marcus, one of the other rangers, called out to me, his voice shaky, "You need to see this." I followed him to a clearing where Jake's equipment had been found, his backpack and hard hat lying in a heap on the ground. But there was no sign of Jake himself. What happened here? I muttered under my breath. The search dogs we'd brought along refused to go any further. They barked and whined, pulling at their leashes like they were terrified of something in the fog-covered trees. One of them even broke free and ran back toward the trucks. I crouched down near Jake's backpack, hoping to find some kind of clue. That's when I noticed it. The same glowing fungus growing on a nearby tree, its light flickering faintly like a warning. As the day stretched on and the fog grew thicker, landmarks started shifting. Trees I'd passed earlier seemed to be in different places now, their massive trunks looming where they hadn't been before. Even with all my experience navigating this forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were lost, or worse, being led somewhere. By nightfall, we had no choice but to call off the search until morning. As we headed back to camp, I couldn't stop thinking about what Victoria had said. If they disturb the grove, it will wake. I didn't want to believe her, but deep down I already did. The disappearance of Jake wasn't something I could just let go of. There was too much about it that didn't make sense. The glowing fungus, the fog, the way the forest seemed to shift around us. I needed answers, and I knew exactly where to start. Victoria's journal had mentioned a logging camp from 1919, not far from the grove. That morning, I decided to head there alone. The fog was still heavy, but I knew this forest better than anyone, or at least I thought I did. It took me hours to find the camp. The place was a ghost town, rotting cabins, rusted tools, and piles of logs that had been abandoned decades ago. The air felt colder here, heavier somehow, like the fog was pressing down on me. Inside one of the cabins, I found more journals, old leather-bound books filled with notes from the loggers who had worked here. Most of it was mundane, weather reports, daily tasks, but then I found entries that made my blood run cold. One journal described workers hearing whispers in the fog at night, voices calling their names from deep within the woods. Another talked about men going missing without a trace, their equipment left behind as if they vanished into thin air. And then there was this entry. The fog moves like it seeps alive. It watches us, follows us. We tried to leave yesterday, but the forest wouldn't let us go. I slammed the journal shut, my heart pounding. This wasn't just some old ghost story. This was real. Whatever had haunted these loggers back then was still here, now. As I stepped outside the cabin, I noticed something strange on one of the nearby trees, a series of carvings etched into its bark. They looked like symbols, but not ones I recognized. Victoria might know what they meant. I drove straight to her house after leaving the camp. She was waiting for me on her porch, as if she'd known I was coming. "Marcus," she said softly, "you've seen it now, haven't you?" I nodded and handed her the journal and a photo I taken of the carvings on the tree. "What do these mean?" She studied them for a long moment before answering. "They part of an old ritual, a binding spell used by my ancestors to keep the guardian spirit tied to this grove." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "So it's real, the spirit?" She nodded solemnly. "It's as real as you and me." Victoria explained that her ancestors had made a pact with this spirit centuries ago, a deal to protect the grove in exchange for leaving it undisturbed. But now that pact was being broken by the highway project and the construction crew. "The fog," she said quietly, "is its warning." I told her about Jake's disappearance and the glowing fungus around the trees. Her face grew grim as she listened. "It's waking up," she said finally. "And if they don't stop, it won't just be Jake." That night back at my cabin, I couldn't stop thinking about what Victoria had said, or about those journals from 1919. As I sat by the fire trying to make sense of it all, something strange happened. When I touched one of my walking stick's carvings, a symbol my mother had etched into it years ago, I saw something. It wasn't a dream or a memory. It was a vision. I saw through its eyes, the guardian spirit's eyes, and what I saw terrified me. Chainsaws ripping through ancient trees, bulldozers tearing apart sacred land, smoke rising as fires consumed everything in their path. And then, I saw myself. That night, the fog came down heavier than I'd ever seen. It wasn't just a mist anymore. It was a wall, thick and impenetrable, swallowing the forest whole. Even the air felt different, colder and damp, like the fog itself was alive. I stayed in my cabin, staring out the window, trying to make sense of everything I'd learned. The journals, the carvings, Victoria's warnings, it all pointed to one thing: something ancient was waking up. Around midnight, the radio crackled to life. Static hissed through the speakers, followed by faint whispers. At first I thought it was interference, maybe a ranger from another station trying to reach me. But then I heard my name. Marcus. It wasn't a voice I recognized. It was soft and distant, like it was coming from deep within the fog. My heart pounded as I grabbed my walking stick and stepped outside. The forest was silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the chirp of crickets, just the fog, stretching endlessly in every direction. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a tall, humanoid figure moving through the mist. But as it came closer, its form became clearer. It wasn't solid like a person. It was made entirely of swirling fog, its edges constantly shifting and reforming. It towered over me, easily twice my height, with glowing orbs where its eyes should have been. I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. The figure stopped a few feet away from me and tilted its head as if studying me. Then it raised an arm, long and wispy, and pointed toward the grove. I didn't understand at first, but then it hit me. It wanted me to follow. Swallowing my fear, I took a step forward. The figure turned and began gliding through the forest, its movements smooth and almost hypnotic. The fog seemed to part for it, revealing a path that hadn't been there before. I followed silently, gripping my walking stick so tightly my hands hurt. We reached the grove in minutes, though it felt like hours, and that's when I saw them, more figures made of fog, smaller than the first, but just as unsettling. They moved between the trees like shadows come to life, their glowing eyes fixed on me. The tallest figure stopped in front of one of the ancient redwoods, the same tree where I'd seen the glowing fungus earlier. It placed a hand on the trunk and turned to face me again. And then it spoke. Not with words exactly, but with images and feelings that filled my mind all at once. Chainsaws ripping through trees, bulldozers tearing up roots, smoke rising as fires consumed everything in their path. And beneath it all was a deep sense of anger. No, not anger, pain. This wasn't just a warning, it was a plea for help. Before I could react, the figures vanished into the fog as quickly as they had appeared. The forest was silent again, but I knew this wasn't over. Something had been set in motion, and there was no stopping it now. The next day, the fog didn't lift. It hung over the park like a heavy curtain, thicker and colder than ever before. I could feel it in my bones. Something was about to happen, something big. By mid-afternoon, I got a call on the radio from Catherine Wilson, the project manager for the highway construction. She sounded panicked. "Powell," she said, her voice trembling, "we set are moving forward with the clearing tonight. The company sent a private security team to oversee it. They said are bringing bulldozers into the grove." I froze. "Catherine, you can sit do this, you don't sit understand what you sit are dealing with." She hesitated before answering. To pull my funding if I don't get this done. I slammed my fist against the dashboard of my truck, frustration boiling over. If you go into that grove tonight, people are going to get hurt, or worse. But she didn't just respond. The line went dead. I knew I had to act fast. I grabbed my walking stick and drove straight to the grove, the fog growing thicker with every mile. By the time I arrived, it was nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The sound of engines rumbled in the distance, bulldozers and trucks making their way toward the sacred trees. Victoria was already there, standing at the edge of the grove with a small bundle of herbs in her hands. Her face was pale, but determined. "They won't listen," she said quietly as I approached. "I know," I replied, gripping my walking stick tightly, "but we have to stop them." She nodded and began chanting softly in Yurok, sprinkling the herbs around the base of one of the ancient trees. The air grew colder, and the fog seemed to thicken even more, swirling around us like it was alive. And then, it came. The fog strider emerged from the mist, its towering form more solid than before. Its glowing eyes burned brighter, and its movements were faster, more deliberate. Smaller figures followed behind it, the childlike mist scouts I'd seen earlier, spreading out through the grove like an army. The bulldozers roared into view, their headlights cutting through the fog. Private security guards armed with rifles stepped out of their trucks, shouting orders and waving flashlights around. "What the hell is this?" one of them yelled as he spotted the figures in the fog. Before anyone could react, the fog strider raised one massive arm and swept it toward them. The fog surged forward like a tidal wave, enveloping the guards and their machines. Their shouts turned to screams as they disappeared into the mist. I ran toward Catherine's truck, banging on her window until she rolled it down. "You have to stop this," I shouted over the chaos. Her face was pale with fear as she looked past me at the swirling fog and glowing eyes in the distance. What is that thing?" "It's trying to protect this place," I said urgently. "But if you keep pushing, it's going to destroy everything and everyone." She hesitated for a moment before nodding slowly. "I'd still call them off." But before she could grab her radio, one of the guards fired a shot into the fog. The sound echoed through the grove like a thunderclap, and everything changed. The fog strider let out a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through my chest like an earthquake. The smaller figures surged forward, their glowing eyes burning brighter as they surrounded the guards and their machines. Victoria stepped forward, clutching her side where she'd been hit by debris from one of the bulldozers earlier. Blood stained her shirt, but she didn't stop chanting. "Marcus," she said weakly, turning to me, "you have to finish this." "What do you mean?" I asked desperately. She handed me a small knife carved from bone and gestured toward my walking stick. "Your bloodline, your connection to this place, it's why you set her here." I didn't fully understand what she meant, but there was no time to question it. I knelt beside one of the glowing trees and pressed my hand against its bark. The visions came flooding back, chainsaws ripping through wood, fires consuming forests, but this time there was something else. Hope. Using the knife Victoria had given me, I made a small cut on my palm and let my blood drip onto one of the glowing fungal patches on the tree's bark. The light flared brighter for a moment before spreading outward through the grove like veins of fire. The fog strider paused its attack and turned toward me, its glowing eyes locked onto mine as if waiting for something. "I stepped here," I said quietly, my voice shaking but steady. "I protect this place." The spirit seemed to understand. Slowly, it lowered its massive arms and began to dissolve back into the mist along with its scouts. As silence fell over the grove once more, Catherine climbed out of her truck and stared at me in disbelief. What just happened?" she asked softly. "The forest made its choice," I replied simply. Victoria collapsed beside me with a faint smile on her lips. Her final words were barely more than a whisper. "You were always meant for this." The grove was quiet now. The fog had started to lift, revealing the ancient trees standing tall and untouched. The bulldozers were still there, but the guards and their trucks were gone, vanished into the mist as if they'd never been there at all. Catherine stood beside me, her face pale and her hands trembling. "What happened to them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the forest had taken them just like it had taken Jake. Whether they were alive or not, I couldn't say. Victoria's body lay beside one of the glowing trees, her face peaceful despite everything that had happened. I knelt beside her, tears stinging my eyes as I placed my hand over hers. She'd given everything to protect this grove, to protect the pact her ancestors had made so long ago. "You didn't deserve this," I whispered. The fungal glow on the trees began to fade, and with it came a strange warmth in my chest. My arthritis, which had plagued me for years, was gone. My joints moved freely, painlessly, as if the forest itself had healed me. But there was something else, a faint glow beneath my skin, like veins of light running through my arms. I didn't understand it fully, but I knew one thing: the forest had changed me. In the days that followed, the highway project was officially abandoned. Catherine filed an environmental review that cited unexplained phenomena in the grove, and no one dared challenge her findings. The grove was declared off-limits to all visitors, a sacred site protected by law. But even with everything resolved, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. The forest had chosen me for a reason, and I knew it would call on me again someday. One evening, as I walked through the grove alone, I felt a presence behind me. Turning around, I saw them. The mist figures. They stood silently among the trees, their glowing eyes watching me but not threatening. It was as if they were waiting for something. I raised my walking stick in acknowledgement and continued on my way. A few weeks later, my son came to visit me for the first time since the divorce. He was hesitant at first. Our relationship had been strained for years, but something about being here seemed to calm him. I took him into the grove and showed him the ancient trees, telling him stories about our ancestors and their connection to this land. As we walked together through the forest, he asked me about the glowing veins in my arms. I told him it was a gift from the grove, a reminder of what we're meant to protect. "Do you think they'll ever come back?" he asked quietly. I looked toward the mist figures in the distance and smiled faintly. They never really left.